There is a number that archaeologists do not like to say out loud at conferences. Not because it is classified, not because someone told them to keep quiet about it, but because the moment you say it, you have to explain everything else that follows from it. And that explanation does not fit neatly into the version of Australian prehistory that has been taught in universities for the past century. The number is 12,800. 12,800 years ago, something happened on this continent that erased a chapter of human civilization so thoroughly that most people alive today have no idea it existed. Not the end of a small nomadic group wandering a dry plain, not the slow fading of an isolated coastal band cut off by rising tides. Something larger. Something that, if the physical evidence means what the physical evidence appears to mean, would require us to rethink almost everything we thought we understood about who was living in Australia, how long they had been organized, and what they had built before the world they knew was taken from them by forces that science is still arguing about today. You are lying somewhere right now, maybe in a bed with the lights low, or on a couch with the television off, or in a room where the only sound is the hum of a fan or the distant noise of a street below a window. You are safe and still, and the world outside your walls is going on without you for a few hours, which is exactly how it should be. And while you are resting here, I want to take you somewhere very far away and very far back. I want to take you to a continent that most of the world still describes, in the language of prehistory, as a place where ancient people lived simple lives in balance with a harsh land, moving with the seasons, leaving no permanent mark. I want to show you why that description, comfortable and tidy as it is, may be one of the most significant misreadings in the entire history of archaeology. Because what is buried under Australia, and what is standing in places where almost no one goes, and what is encoded in oral traditions that were nearly wiped out by colonization, and what is showing up now under the scans and the satellite passes and the ground-penetrating instruments that did not exist 20 years ago, tells a different story. A story about people who organize themselves across vast distances. A story about structures that imply planning, labor coordination, and a relationship to the land that goes far beyond what we have been willing to credit. A story that ends, abruptly and violently, 12,800 years ago, when something struck this planet from outside it, or erupted within it, or both at once, and the continent that had been home to one of the longest unbroken civilizations on Earth was reshaped in ways that took thousands of years to recover from. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. We are going to start at the beginning of the end. At the moment, 12,800 years ago, when the evidence says something went very wrong, very fast, and we are going to work backward and forward from that moment until the picture is as complete as the available evidence allows it to be. Which is, I should warn you now, not as complete as any of us would like. There are gaps. There are points where the record goes silent, and the silence itself becomes the clue. There are places in this story where the only honest thing to say is that we do not know, and where that admission opens a door to questions that are, if anything, more unsettling than any answer we might prefer. So settle in. Let the weight of the day go. And let me tell you about Australia before the fire. There is a moment in science when a piece of evidence arrives that does not fit any existing category, and the first instinct of every person in the room is to look for the most conservative explanation available. If the evidence can be explained away, it will be. If it can be attributed to contamination or measurement error, or the kind of ambiguity that is always present at the edges of the detectable record, that attribution will be made quickly and without much resistance, because the alternative, which is to accept that the evidence is genuine and to follow it where it leads, is expensive and destabilizing and tends to end careers in ways that the alternative does not. This is not a conspiracy. This is just how knowledge communities work. They protect what they have built. They are cautious about what they allow through the gate. And in most cases, this caution serves science well. But in the case of Australian prehistory, it has meant that a body of evidence that has been accumulating for decades has been consistently minimised, and the minimisation has produced a picture of ancient Australia that is, by any honest reading of the current physical record, incomplete in ways that matter. Let me give you a specific example of what I mean. In 2019, a research team working in the Flinders Ranges of South Australia published a paper in the journal Nature that changed the accepted date for human arrival in Australia. The previous consensus date, held with some confidence for decades, was approximately 65,000 years. The new paper, based on a site called Warratee Rock Shelter, pushed that date back toward 80,000 years, possibly further. The announcement was significant, and it was covered in the science press with appropriate attention. But what received far less attention was the implication that now flowed from it. Because if humans were in Australia 80,000 years or more ago, they had been there for a period of time so long that the question of what they built and organised and developed during that span becomes genuinely difficult to contain within the standard framework. 80,000 years is 4 times the entire span of recorded human history. It is longer than the gap between us and the Neanderthals. It is a duration so vast that trying to imagine a people who spent it without developing complex social structures, without constructing things that would leave a mark, without organizing their relationship to the land in ways that go beyond simple foraging, requires an active assumption that the physical evidence is increasingly unwilling to support. And yet, for most of the 20th century, that assumption was standard. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia were categorized in the dominant archaeological literature as perhaps the world's oldest continuous culture, but also as a culture that had not developed in the directions that produce what Western archaeology tends to recognize as civilization. No cities. No monumental construction in the conventional sense, no writing, no metallurgy, no agriculture in the European sense of the word. This characterization was not entirely wrong in its specific claims, but it was profoundly wrong in its implication, which was that the absence of these particular markers meant the absence of complexity. What was being overlooked was a body of evidence that pointed toward a different kind of complexity. One that was real, was organized, was geographically vast, and by 12,800 years ago, was old enough to have developed features that we are only now beginning to have the instruments to detect. Let us talk about water. In the Western District of Victoria, there is a place called Budge Bim. Until 2019, most people outside of archaeological circles had never heard of it. In that year, UNESCO inscribed it on the World Heritage List, and the language used in that inscription was careful and measured and represented a significant acknowledgement that something had been understood incorrectly for a long time. What is at Budge Bim is an aquaculture system, a set of channels and weirs and stone traps built by the Gunditj Mara people to harvest eels. The channels are constructed from basalt stone. They connect lakes and wetlands across a network that covers hundreds of square kilometers. And the key fact, the one that changes the conversation when you sit with it long enough, is the date. The Budge Bim aquaculture system is at least 6,600 years old, possibly older. That makes it one of the oldest fish traps on Earth. Older than the pyramids at Giza by more than 3,000 years. Older than Stonehenge. Older than the first writing in Mesopotamia. Older than almost every structure that Western civilization tends to use as its benchmark for when organized, intentional, large-scale construction began. And Budge Bim is not an isolated case. It is rather one of the better documented examples of a pattern that appears across the continent once you know to look for it. The Brewarina fish traps in New South Wales are among the oldest human constructions on Earth by some estimates, with dates that some researchers place in the tens of thousands of years. The stone arrangements at Wurdi Yuang in Victoria which align with solar events and imply astronomical knowledge, are old enough that the precise date remains contested. The Carryong glyphs north of Sydney remain officially unexplained. The stone-walled enclosures in the Cape York Peninsula that do not fit any accepted model for what the people of that region were doing at the times the walls were apparently built. And then, above all of these, above every specific site and every specific artifact, and every specific contested date, there is the question of what was here before 12,800 years ago, and why the evidence for that period is so much harder to find than the evidence for the period that followed it. This is where the story gets complicated, and this is where the number matters. 12,800 years ago, something happened not just in Australia but across the entire planet. The evidence for this event has been accumulating in the scientific literature since the early 2000s, and it remains one of the most contested questions in quaternary science, which is the study of the most recent geological period, the one we are still living in. The debate centers on a hypothesis that was formally proposed in 2007 in a paper published by a team of researchers in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. The paper argued that around 12,800 years ago, the Earth was struck by one or more fragments of a disintegrating comet, or experienced a related extraterrestrial event that caused a rapid global cooling event, a period of catastrophic fires, and the simultaneous extinction of dozens of large animal species across multiple continents. This hypothesis is called the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, and it is, to put it plainly, one of the most argued about ideas in science over the past 2 decades. The opposition to it has been fierce. There have been papers challenging every piece of physical evidence offered in its support. There have been methodological critiques, statistical challenges, accusations of data misinterpretation, and the proponents of the hypothesis have responded with more data, more sites, more refined analysis. The debate is not settled. What is settled is that something happened at 12,800 years ago that shows up in the physical record with unusual clarity across multiple continents. The Younger Dryas itself, the sudden cold period that lasted roughly 1,200 years, is not in dispute. What is disputed is what caused it. And the answer to that question matters enormously for the story of ancient Australia, because if the cause was an impact or series of impacts, then the effects on a continent the size of Australia, which was at that time wetter and greener and more heavily populated than it became afterward, would have been profound and rapid and devastating in ways that would explain a great deal of what the physical record of that period shows. The temperature dropped. It dropped fast. In some regions, the change in mean temperature within decades was several degrees, which in ecological terms is catastrophic. The monsoon systems that fed Australia's interior were disrupted. The Great Lakes that had filled the center of the continent, Lake Eyre and its associated systems, began the long process of drying that would eventually turn much of central Australia into the desert it is today. The megafauna that had been declining accelerated toward extinction, and the people who had been living here for at minimum 80,000 years, who had organized themselves across this continent in ways we are only beginning to understand, faced a catastrophe that reshaped their world within a human lifetime. But before we follow that catastrophe to its consequences, we need to understand what was here. We need to go further back than 12,800 years. We need to ask what Australia looked like before the cold came, before the fires swept across the interior, before the lakes dried and the sea rose, and the civilization that had been building for millennia was driven to reinvent itself from in the edges. The Australia of 20,000 years ago was a fundamentally different place. The sea level was lower by approximately 120 meters. This is not a small number. 120 meters of sea level difference means that the coastline of the continent extended significantly further in every direction. The landmass was larger. The continental shelf that is now underwater was above water, and significant stretches of it were habitable. The land bridge connecting Australia to New Guinea was solid ground. The Sahul Shelf, which now lies beneath the waters of the Timor Sea and the Arafura Sea, was a territory the size of Western Europe. People lived on it. They built their communities there. They developed their relationships to that land over thousands of years. And then, when the ice melted and the sea rose, that world went underwater. Not all at once, not dramatically, in human terms. The sea rose over thousands of years, but it rose, and everything that had been built on those now submerged shelves went with it. This is one of the reasons why the archaeological record for ancient Australia is so incomplete. Not because nothing was there, because where the things were is now under the ocean. There is a branch of archaeology called maritime archaeology, and within it there is a subfield focused on submerged landscapes, the lands that were above water during the last ice age and are now beneath the sea. This field is young because the technology required to survey these environments at depth is young, but it has already produced results that are changing the way researchers think about the distribution of ancient population and ancient construction. In Australia, systematic survey of the submerged continental shelf has barely begun. The distances involved are vast, the water is deep, and the funding for this kind of work is limited by the fact that the results, when they come, tend to disturb established timelines. But what has been found in the limited surveys that have been conducted along the northwestern shelf and the southern coasts includes stone artifacts, hearth remnants, and structural features at depths that correspond to sea levels of between 15,000 and 20,000 years ago. These are not anomalous flints that rolled into the sea. These are assemblages. Collections of material that imply habitation, that imply people living in those places and doing the things that people do, which includes modifying the landscape, building structures, maintaining fires, and organizing their communities around features of the land that they understood and valued. The implications are significant. If the submerged shelf of Australia contains the physical evidence of organized occupation across the period before 12,800 years ago, then the picture of ancient Australian civilization that has been built from the archaeology of the interior alone is necessarily partial. It is a picture drawn from what survived above water, which is a subset of what was built, which is itself a subset of what was present. The full picture, the one that the evidence is working toward, even if it has not arrived yet, is larger, it is older, and it is more complex. We need to talk about the oral record. There is a reason that Aboriginal oral traditions are increasingly being taken seriously by geologists and climatologists, and that reason is not sentiment, it is accuracy. In 2016, a researcher named Patrick Nunn, working with Nicholas Reed, published a paper in the Journal of Quaternary Science analysing a set of Aboriginal oral traditions from various coastal communities around Australia. The traditions described events in which the sea rose and swallowed land. They named specific places, described specific features of the landscape that were lost, and preserved memories of a time when the coastline was in a different position. When Nunn and Reed compared these traditions to the known record of sea level rise at the end of the last ice age, the correspondence was remarkable. The traditions appeared to describe actual events that occurred between 7,000 and 10,000 years ago, preserved in oral form across hundreds of generations, with enough precision to be geographically verifiable. This is extraordinary by any measure. It means that some Aboriginal traditions represent an unbroken oral record of events that occurred before the invention of writing anywhere on Earth. It means that the knowledge systems developed by the peoples of this continent were robust enough to preserve accurate geographical information across timescales that no other human knowledge tradition has demonstrably achieved. And it opens the question of what else those traditions might be preserving. Because the traditions do not stop at sea level rise, they describe a world that existed before the current world. They describe landscapes, animals, relationships to the land, and events that do not map onto anything in the post-Holocene environment. Some of them describe catastrophic events from the sky. Some of them describe a time when the stars looked different, which would require a date so far in the past that it challenges modern dating methods to verify. Some of them describe beings and structures and arrangements of the world that have no obvious match in the physical record as it currently stands, but which might find matches in the physical record that is still submerged beneath the sea. I want to be careful here. I want to be precise about what the oral traditions mean and what they do not mean. They are not a literal history in the Western documentary sense. They are knowledge encoded in story, which is the most durable form of encoding that any pre-literate society has access to, and they have demonstrably preserved accurate information across vast periods of time. They are also subject to interpretation, and the interpretations of non-Indigenous scholars have historically been neither humble nor accurate enough to be fully trusted. But the core observation stands. These traditions are telling us something. And when the geological and archaeological record begins to catch up to what the traditions describe, the responsible position is to take the traditions seriously, rather than to wait for the physical record to confirm everything before doing so. What the traditions describe, in broad outline, is a world that existed before the current order. A world in which the peoples of this continent had relationships to the land, to each other, and to the physical environment that were more extensive and more organized than the post-catastrophe world that the historical record has known. A world that ended. The question is, what ended it? Let us look at the physical evidence for the event at 12,800 years ago, and let us look specifically at what that evidence looks like in Australia. In sediment cores from lakes across Australia, at the boundary layer corresponding to the beginning of the Younger Dryas, there are anomalies. The layers are not uniform. They show the kind of disruption that geologists associate with rapid catastrophic events rather than gradual environmental change. There are elevated levels of platinum and iridium in some cores, elements that are rare in the terrestrial environment but are associated with extraterrestrial material. There are nanodiamonds, which are tiny structures that can be produced by the extreme pressures associated with a major impact event. There is spherulite glass, tiny beads of fused silica, which can form in the high-temperature conditions associated with cosmic impacts, or the fires they produce. The presence of these markers at the same stratigraphic horizon across multiple Australian sites is one of the pieces of evidence that the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis researchers point to as support for their theory. The critics of the hypothesis have challenged the interpretation of these markers at every turn. They have argued that the platinum anomalies are not statistically significant. They have argued that nanodiamonds can form through non-impact processes. They have argued that the cosmic spherulites could have other origins. These challenges are legitimate scientific objections, and some of them have been answered more convincingly than others. The debate continues. But the physical markers are there, in the sediment cores, at the right horizon, across multiple sites. And whatever caused them, their presence at 12,800 years ago marks the beginning of a period that was, by any reading of the subsequent record, catastrophic for the peoples living in Australia at the time. The fires. One of the best documented aspects of the Younger Dryas onset in Australia is the record of fire. Charcoal layers in sediment cores from Australian lakes and bogs show a dramatic spike at the beginning of the Younger Dryas period. The spike is not the kind of gradual increase that would be associated with a slow drying of the climate. It is an abrupt jump, a sudden and massive increase in the amount of burned material being deposited in lakes that were, in some cases, hundreds of kilometers from any obvious ignition source. This pattern is consistent with what you would expect if a large area of the continent had burned rapidly, in a way that produced ash and charcoal at a scale that overwhelmed the normal depositional processes. Some researchers have proposed that the fires were caused by humans, a form of landscape management that got out of hand during a period of climate stress. Others have proposed that the fires were triggered by the climate change itself, as drying conditions made vegetation more combustible. The impact hypothesis adds a third possibility. that the fires were ignited directly or indirectly by the impact event, either through the direct thermal pulse of an airburst or through the secondary effects of debris falling across a wide area. All three mechanisms could have operated simultaneously. The record does not allow us to distinguish cleanly between them. What the record does show is that the fires were large, that they were rapid, and that they occurred at the same time as a set of other changes that together constituted a near-total transformation of the Australian environment within a period that, in geological terms, was essentially instantaneous. And the people who were living through this were not abstract, they were real. They had communities, relationships, structures, knowledge systems, and commitments to specific places that had been built up over thousands of years. When their world burned, they did not simply adapt and move on. Some of them died. The population crash that the genetic record implies for this period in Australia is consistent with a catastrophic event, not a gradual environmental adjustment. The bottleneck in the Australian genetic record at this time, the point where diversity narrows and the population appears to have contracted sharply, matches the timing of the Younger Dryas onset with uncomfortable precision. We need to talk about what was lost. This is the hardest part of the story to tell, because by definition, what was lost is what we cannot see. We can only infer it from the gaps, from the absence of evidence in a record where evidence should be expected, from the contrast between what we know was present before and what appears to have survived after. Before 12,800 years ago, Australia had a wet interior. The lake systems of Central Australia, Lake Eyre, and its tributaries were full. The Darling and Murray River systems were larger than they are now, fed by more reliable rainfall. The grasslands of the interior were more extensive. The vegetation was more diverse, and the population was distributed more evenly across the continent, not concentrated in the coastal regions where most archaeological sites from after the catastrophe are found. This distribution matters. A population spread across a wetter, more productive landscape with reliable water sources and rich ecological zones across the interior would have been able to support a higher density of people than a population confined to coastal strips and river valleys. Higher density means more specialization. More specialization means more complexity. More complexity means more of the things we associate with organized civilization: construction, management of resources, maintenance of knowledge across generations, development of social hierarchies, and the physical markers of all of this that we call, in the shorthand of archaeology, civilization. The physical markers of that pre-catastrophe civilization are what we cannot find, or rather, what we have not found yet, because most of where they would be is either underwater, buried under the sediment layers that accumulated after the catastrophe, or in regions that have not been systematically surveyed. But there are hints. There are places where the physical record suggests that something organized was present before the record becomes readable. The stone arrangements of the continent are one of these hints. There are thousands of them. Some are documented, many are not. They range from small, locally significant arrangements to large, geographically extensive systems that imply a relationship to the landscape that goes well beyond casual marking. The Murujuga Rock Art Complex in Western Australia, which includes the largest and oldest collection of petroglyphs in the world, contains images of animals that are no longer present in the region and in some cases no longer exist anywhere on Earth. The Thylacine, which went extinct on the mainland long before European contact. Species that were present during the Pleistocene but disappeared at or near the time of the Younger Dryas event. This means that some of the art at Murujuga was made by people who were living alongside those animals, which gives it a minimum age that pushes it well past the comfortable boundaries of most archaeological frameworks. And Murujuga is not just art in the sense of decoration. The arrangement of figures across the site, the relationship between different panels, the way that certain images are positioned relative to others and relative to the landscape they inhabit, suggests a system of meaning that extended across space and time in ways that are not yet fully understood. It is not a random gallery, it is organized. And the organization implies a community of people who maintained and extended it across many generations, which is itself a marker of social complexity. Let me take you to a specific place. I want to describe it in enough detail that you can picture it, because the abstract language of archaeological reports tends to drain the life out of things that are, in their physical reality, extraordinary. In the southwestern corner of Queensland, where the landscape is flat and hot and the horizon in every direction seems to extend forever, there is a feature called the Cunnamulla stone arrangements. They are not famous. They do not appear in most tourist guides to ancient Australia. They are accessible only by long drives on unsealed roads, and even then, they require local knowledge to find. But they exist, and they are large, and they are old, and they are organized in ways that make the conventional explanation of casual or ceremonial stone placement feel inadequate. The arrangements consist of thousands of individual stones. Some of them move significant distances from their points of origin, placed in patterns that follow consistent geometric principles across an area covering many square kilometers. There are alignments. There are concentric forms. There are what appear to be pathways between larger features. The whole system, if you map it from the air, which you can now do with satellite imagery in ways that were impossible 20 years ago, looks less like a collection of isolated ceremonial features and more like a designed landscape, a place that was organized according to a plan that took into account both the local geography and something beyond it, possibly astronomical, possibly related to the management of resources, possibly both. The age of these arrangements is contested in the way that the age of almost everything in Australian prehistory is contested. The stones themselves cannot be dated directly. The sediment beneath them can be, and where that work has been done, the results have tended to be inconvenient for conventional timelines, suggesting occupation and modification of the landscape at dates that push against the boundaries of what the standard narrative allows. This is a pattern that repeats across the continent. Whenever the physical record is examined with new tools, new methods, new willingness to follow the evidence rather than defend the framework, the results are older and more complex than expected. The Bujbim aquaculture system, which was recognized as extraordinary when it was formally documented, is now understood to be part of a larger tradition of landscape management that extends across the continent and back in time further than any single site has been dated. The fish traps at Brew Arena are so large and so technically sophisticated that their construction would have required coordinated labor across multiple communities and sustained effort over long periods. The stone-walled enclosures of the Kimberley that appear on satellite imagery in configurations that have not been explained by conventional models of hunter-gatherer land use. And underneath all of these visible features, in the sediment layers and the genetic record and the oral traditions and the comparative linguistics, there is a picture emerging of a society, or a set of interrelated societies, that was doing something on this continent before 12,800 years ago that we have not given it credit for doing. Let me tell you about the water management. Australia is, in its current state, one of the driest inhabited continents on Earth. The interior is largely desert. Rainfall is unreliable. Water is the defining constraint on where people can live and what they can do with the land. Managing water is not an option in Australia. It is the fundamental prerequisite for everything else, and the evidence suggests that the peoples of Australia understood this in a way that produced, over thousands of years, a system of landscape modification for water management that was sophisticated enough to be described, without exaggeration, as engineering. The eel traps at Bujbim are the most formally documented example, but they are part of a pattern that includes channel systems in the Murray-Darling Basin that appear to predate European contact by thousands of years, stone weirs in Queensland river systems that were described by early European explorers and have since been surveyed in enough detail to establish that their construction required knowledge of hydrology and materials that the explorers of the time did not believe the local people possessed, and modifications to natural watercourses across the arid interior that made permanent habitation possible in areas that the conventional model assumed were occupied only seasonally. This water management infrastructure represents exactly the kind of large-scale, long-term, organized landscape modification that we associate with the early stages of what we call civilization in other parts of the world. In Mesopotamia, the organization of irrigation systems is one of the markers that archaeologists use to identify the transition from complex hunter-gatherer societies to what they call early urban societies. In Egypt, the management of the Nile flood is one of the organizing principles around which early Egyptian society cohered. In the Americas, the agricultural terracing and water management systems of the Andean cultures are recognized as civilization-level achievements. In Australia, the equivalent systems have been categorized as something less than this, partly because of the absence of writing and metallurgy, and partly because the researchers doing the categorizing were working within a framework that was not designed to recognize what they were looking at. That framework is changing. Slowly, with resistance, and not without controversy, but it is changing. And as it changes, the picture of ancient Australia is becoming more complex, more organized, and more tragic, because the more complex and organized the pre-catastrophe world appears, the more we understand about what was lost when the catastrophe came. At 12,800 years ago, the Younger Dryas onset, whatever its precise cause, triggered a cascade of environmental changes that transformed Australia within decades. The temperature dropped. The monsoon weakened. The lake systems of the interior began to shrink. The grasslands dried. The fires swept across the vegetation. And the people who had been living on this continent for at least 80,000 years, who had organized their communities around the reliable water sources and the rich ecological zones and the knowledge systems that had been refined across that unimaginable span of time, found themselves facing a catastrophe for which nothing in their experience had prepared them. This is not speculation. The evidence of the catastrophe is in the record. What the record does not show directly, and what I want you to hold in mind as we continue, is the texture of what that catastrophe felt like to the people living through it. Because it is easy to talk about environmental change in the abstract language of sediment cores and pollen records and stable isotope analysis. And it is harder, but more important, to remember that every change in those records corresponds to a change in the lives of real people who were trying to survive, who were watching the lakes their grandparents had known begin to shrink, who were seeing the animals they had depended on for food become scarce, who were carrying their children to places that their oral traditions had not prepared them for. The population bottleneck in the Australian genetic record at this time is real. The diversity contracted. The communities that had been spread across the continent were reduced, concentrated, forced into the areas that retained enough water and productivity to sustain life. The great organized systems of the interior, the water management infrastructure, the stone arrangements, the aquaculture networks, were abandoned or maintained at reduced scale, or remembered in forms that became increasingly abstract as the generations passed and the people who had built them were fewer and further from the places they had built them. And then, over the following millennia, something extraordinary happened. The people of this continent rebuilt. Not in the same forms, not in the same places, not with the same density or the same kind of organized landscape modification that the pre-catastrophe world had supported, but they rebuilt. They maintained the knowledge traditions. They preserved the oral records. They adapted the water management practices to the reduced rainfall. They continued to read the landscape with the same intelligence that had built the eel traps and the fish weirs and the stone arrangements of the period before the catastrophe. And they survived. Through the Younger Dryas cold period and the subsequent warming and the sea level rise of the early Holocene and the further drying of the interior that followed until the present day, when Aboriginal communities across Australia are the living inheritors of what is demonstrably the world's oldest continuous cultural tradition. That is not a small thing. That is, by any measure, one of the most remarkable human achievements in the entire record of our species. And the reason it tends to be described in quiet, qualified language, rather than celebrated with the recognition it deserves, is partly the legacy of colonization, which systematically devalued what it was destroying, and partly the legacy of an archaeological framework that was not built to recognize complexity in forms it did not expect. But it is also, I think, partly because the story of what happened 12,800 years ago is a story that, if told honestly, requires acknowledging something that is uncomfortable for several different reasons. It requires acknowledging that a civilization of real sophistication existed on this continent before the catastrophe. It requires acknowledging that the catastrophe was, by any human measure, a tragedy of enormous scale. And it requires sitting with the uncertainty about what exactly caused it, because the uncertainty is genuine, and resolving it in one direction or another has implications that different groups of people find uncomfortable for different reasons. The mainstream of science, as I noted at the beginning, has been cautious about the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. The caution is scientifically legitimate, but the alternative explanations for the Younger Dryas onset have their own problems, and the accumulation of physical evidence in support of some form of extraterrestrial contribution to the event has been steady enough that the hypothesis is no longer easily dismissed. New papers continue to appear, new sites, in Australia and elsewhere, continue to produce the markers that the hypothesis predicts. The debate continues. What I can tell you is that whatever caused the Younger Dryas, the event itself was real, its effects on Australia were profound, and the civilization that existed here before, it deserves to be understood on its own terms, rather than measured against a standard that was designed for a different history in a different place. Let us now go further into the evidence. Let us look at the specific markers of the impact hypothesis in the Australian record, and at the evidence for organised habitation before the event, and at what the combination of these two threads of evidence suggests about the nature of the world that was lost. The cosmic spherolites found in Australian sediment cores are one of the more intriguing pieces of physical evidence for an extraterrestrial contribution to the Younger Dryas onset. These are tiny, perfectly round beads of glass, formed when material is heated to extreme temperatures and then rapidly cooled. They are found in sediment layers around the world at the Younger Dryas boundary, and their distribution pattern, which spans multiple continents, is one of the pieces of evidence that has convinced some researchers that the event responsible for them was global rather than local. In Australia, the spherolites have been found in sediment cores from Lake Eyre, from coastal bog sites in Tasmania, and from several cave sites in Western Australia. Their presence at these locations, at the same stratigraphic horizon, is consistent with the global pattern. The platinum anomaly is another marker. Platinum is extremely rare in the terrestrial environment. It is, however, relatively common in certain types of meteorites and cometary material. An anomalous spike in platinum concentration at the Younger Dryas boundary has been documented at sites around the world, including several in Australia. The critics of the impact hypothesis have offered alternative explanations for the platinum spike, including volcanic activity and changes in erosion patterns, but the alternative explanations have been more difficult to sustain as the number of sites showing the anomaly has increased. Then there is the carbon. 1,4 excursion. At around 12,800 years ago, there is a detectable spike in atmospheric carbon, 1,4, that is recorded in tree ring records and in the sediment record. Carbon, 1,4, is produced in the atmosphere by the interaction of cosmic rays with nitrogen atoms, and an anomalous spike in its production rate at this time is consistent with a large influx of cosmic energy, whether from a major solar event or from an impact that disrupted the upper atmosphere. The carbon 14 excursion is not disputed. Its cause is the sum of these physical markers, taken together and considered alongside the ecological changes of the Younger Dryas onset, represents a body of evidence that is at minimum consistent with a major external contribution to the event that transformed Australia 12,800 years ago. It does not prove the impact hypothesis beyond all doubt. Science rarely works that way. But it is enough to take seriously, and it is enough to change how we think about the world that preceded the event. Because if the Younger Dryas onset involved a significant extraterrestrial contribution, then the world that existed before it was not ended by the slow pressure of climate change, which a complex, organized society might have had time to adapt to. It was ended abruptly, in a form that no amount of social organization or knowledge could fully anticipate or respond to. The fires came, the temperatures dropped, the lakes began to shrink, and the people who had built the water management systems and the aquaculture networks and the stone arrangements of the interior found themselves in a world that was changing faster than their systems had been designed to accommodate. This is important for understanding what was lost. A society that adapts to gradual climate change may preserve its knowledge systems, may relocate its communities, may maintain continuity through the transition. A society that is hit by an abrupt, catastrophic event may not. Knowledge that exists only in living memory, in oral tradition, in the physical maintenance of infrastructure that requires active upkeep to function, is vulnerable to catastrophic population loss in ways that knowledge stored in durable physical media is not. If the Younger Dryas onset was rapid enough, and if the population loss in Australia was severe enough, then some of the knowledge that had been accumulated over 80,000 years of organized habitation may simply have ceased to exist, not gradually, not over generations, in the span of years. The oral traditions that survived the catastrophe are not the complete record of the pre-catastrophe world. They are the fragment that lived through the filter of near extinction and managed to be passed on, modified by the experience of catastrophe and the reduced populations that came after it into the forms that eventually reached the people who recorded them. They are extraordinary. They are the oldest continuous oral traditions on Earth, but they are the survivors of a cull, not the full library that existed before the cull, and acknowledging that changes how we read them. Let me tell you about a specific tradition. There is a story, recorded in multiple versions across Aboriginal communities in South Australia and the Northern Territory, about a time when the sky people came and the stars fell and the land was burned and the waters rose and the world as it had been known was ended. The story does not describe these events with the vocabulary of modern cosmology. It describes them in the language of the tradition that preserved them, which is the language of narrative, of personified forces, of stories that carry meaning in their structure and their imagery, as well as in their literal content. But when researchers with backgrounds in geology and atmospheric science have looked at the specific imagery of these traditions alongside the physical record of the Younger Dryas onset, the correspondences are striking enough to warrant serious attention. The sky people who come and burn the land, the stars that fall, the waters that rise. These are not metaphors without reference. They describe, in the narrative language of oral tradition, a sequence of events that is consistent with a major impact or airburst event, followed by the fires that such an event would produce, followed by the sea level rise that occurred as the ice melted during the subsequent warming. The sequence is correct. The order is right. And the traditions locate these events in a time that is described as before the current world, before the present order of things, before the time that the people of the tradition have direct memory of, which is exactly where 12,800 years ago would sit in an oral tradition that has been maintained to the present day. This does not prove that the traditions are describing the Younger Dryas onset. It does suggest that the dismissal of oral traditions as mere mythology, as narrative decoration without historical content, is a mistake that may have been costing us access to genuine historical information for a very long time. The genetic record adds another layer. The population bottleneck in Aboriginal Australian genetics at the time of the Younger Dryas is not as severe as the great bottleneck of 900,000 years ago that affected the entire human lineage, but it is detectable. The diversity that was present in the pre-Younger Dryas population contracted. Groups that had been genetically distinct over thousands of years of separation and limited interbreeding suddenly appear to have come into more frequent contact with each other, which is consistent with a catastrophic displacement, a forcing together of populations that had previously occupied separate territories across a larger and more productive landscape. When your territory becomes uninhabitable, you move. When you move, you encounter the people of the territories you move into. The genetic record of the mixing that follows can be dated, and the dating of this mixing event in Australia places it at or near the Younger Dryas boundary. The linguistic record is harder to read, because the reconstruction of ancient languages requires either written records or the careful comparative analysis of surviving languages. And in Australia, many of the languages that existed before European colonization are gone, their speakers having died or been forcibly prevented from using them. But the linguistic diversity that survives, which is remarkable, with hundreds of distinct languages in a single continent, can be read as evidence of a population that separated into isolated communities at some point and then maintained those separations over a long period. The separations may date to the post-catastrophe reorganization of communities across a reduced and more fragmented landscape, with the distances between permanent water sources acting as barriers that preserved linguistic differences over the millennia that followed the Younger Dryas. We need to talk about Mungo. In the Willandra Lakes region of New South Wales, there is a place called Lake Mungo. It is a dry lake now, a lunette of wind-deposited sediment on its eastern shore, a flat bowl of cracked earth where the wind moves without obstacle, and the light in the early morning is the color of old bone. In 1974, a researcher named Alan Thorne recovered human remains from the eroding edge of the lake shore. The remains were those of a young woman, and she had been buried with ceremony. Her body had been covered in red ochre, the same iron-rich pigment that appears in burials across the continent and across tens of thousands of years, and her burial had been deliberate, careful, intentional. She was not simply the dead of a passing camp. She was someone whose community had taken the time, in their grief, to mark her departure from the world with meaning. The remains were initially dated to around 26,000 years ago. Subsequent dating revised this figure upward to somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000 years ago. The Mungo Lady, as she came to be known, is one of the oldest known examples of ritual burial anywhere on Earth. And she was found in a region that, at the time of her burial, was a productive lakeside environment with abundant food, reliable water, and the kind of ecological richness that supports complex, organized human communities. The Willandra Lakes region continued to yield remains and artifacts over the subsequent decades. Mungo Man, found in 1974 in the same area, was also covered in ochre and was also buried with intention. The assemblages from the region span an enormous period of time and demonstrate continuous occupation of the lakes area through multiple climatic periods. And the record from the Willandra Lakes, when placed alongside the evidence from Budgebim and the Brewarina fish traps and the Murujuga petroglyphs and the stone arrangements of the interior, begins to build a picture of a continent that was not simply occupied but was organized, managed, and inhabited by communities with complex social structures and sophisticated knowledge systems, over a period of time that dwarfs the entire history of recorded civilization. And then Lake Mungo dried, not because of the Younger Dryas directly, at least not in its initial phase, but because of the cumulative effects of the climate changes that the Younger Dryas set in motion. The lake that had supported communities for tens of thousands of years became the dry, wind-scoured landscape it is today. The people who had lived there moved. Some of their descendants are still alive, but the lake is gone, and with it, most of the physical evidence of the communities that had gathered around it. This is the pattern. The wet places dried, the productive places became marginal. The communities that had organized themselves around the productive interior were forced toward the coasts and the river systems that retained water through the Younger Dryas and the subsequent millennia. And as they moved, they carried what they could carry, which was knowledge and tradition and relationship, and left behind what could not be carried, which was infrastructure and the accumulated physical modification of the landscape that their communities had built. The eel traps at Buj Bim are one of the things that survived the transition because they were built in a location that retained water. The basalt from which they were constructed is durable. The channel system, once established, largely maintains itself as long as the water continues to flow. And the Gunditjmara people, whose ancestors built the system, maintained their relationship to that place through the Younger Dryas and the Holocene and everything that followed. They are still there. The system is still there. And the UNESCO inscription of 2019 represents, among other things, a formal acknowledgement by the international community that what the Gunditjmara built is civilization-level infrastructure by any reasonable definition of the term. But Buj Bim is the exception. Most of what was built on this continent before 12,800 years ago is gone, or submerged, or buried under sediment, or standing in remote locations that have not yet been systematically surveyed. The absence is the point. The silence in the record is itself a marker of the catastrophe. I want to turn now to the question of what the Younger Dryas meant for the rest of the world, and to the evidence that the event, whatever its cause, was global in its effects. This matters for the Australian story because Australia did not experience the catastrophe in isolation. The same event, or the same sequence of events, that transformed Australia simultaneously transformed North America, Europe, the Middle East, and other regions where organized human societies had been developing. And the way that the catastrophic event filtered through the record in those other regions provides context for understanding what it might have looked like in Australia. In North America, the Younger Dryas onset corresponds to the end of what archaeologists call the Clovis culture, the earliest, widely accepted tradition of organized human occupation of the Americas. The Clovis people, who had been living in North America for at most a few thousand years before the Younger Dryas, disappeared from the record at approximately the same time as the catastrophe. The megafauna of the Americas, the mammoths and mastodons and giant ground sloths and horses and camels, went extinct at or near the Younger Dryas boundary. The Clovis points, the distinctive stone tools that mark their culture in the archaeological record, simply stop appearing after 12,800 years ago. This is one of the most significant transitions in the archaeological record of the Americas, and its timing relative to the Younger Dryas has been interpreted in different ways by different researchers. The conventional explanation has been overkill, the idea that the newly arrived Clovis hunters, facing a megafauna that had never encountered human hunters before, drove the animals to extinction through hunting pressure, with the climate change of the Younger Dryas providing additional stress that pushed already declining populations over the edge. The impact hypothesis offers a different sequence, in which the impact event killed some of the megafauna directly, disrupted the ecosystems that the rest depended on, and eliminated the Clovis culture along with them in a catastrophe that happened too fast for overkill to explain. The debate in North America is parallel to the debate in Australia, and the physical markers are similar. Cosmic spherolites at the Younger Dryas boundary, platinum anomalies, nanodiamonds, burned material in sediment layers that correspond to widespread fire across the continent. The evidence is contested in both regions, and in both regions it points in the same direction. In the Middle East, the Younger Dryas corresponds to the collapse of the Natufian culture, which had been developing the early stages of agriculture and sedentary settlement in the Levant for several thousand years before the catastrophe. The Natufians retreated from their settlements and returned to a more mobile lifestyle during the Younger Dryas cold period, then re-emerged on the other side of it to develop the full Neolithic revolution that eventually produced the agricultural civilizations of Mesopotamia. The story of the Natufian retreat and recovery is one of the better documented cases of the Younger Dryas disrupting organized human society, and it provides a template for understanding what may have happened in other regions where the documentation is less complete. In Australia, there is no comparable documentation of the pre-catastrophe culture, no equivalent of the Natufian sites that can be excavated and analysed in the detail that the Levantine archaeology has allowed. The Australian sites that might provide that documentation are mostly underwater or buried under sediment, or in locations that have not been systematically investigated. But the pattern of the catastrophe and recovery in Australia, insofar as the physical record allows us to reconstruct it, is consistent with what we see in the Natufian case. A complex society, disrupted by a rapid environmental catastrophe, retreating from its most developed forms, contracting and reorganizing, and then recovering in modified forms that preserve the essential knowledge while adapting to the changed landscape. The recovery in Australia took longer than the recovery in the Levant. The Levantine Natufians were producing the first permanent agricultural villages within a few thousand years of the Younger Dryas ending. The Aboriginal societies of Australia, working with a different ecology, a different resource base, and a landscape that had been transformed in ways that the Levantine landscape had not, took longer to rebuild toward the levels of social complexity that the pre-catastrophe period had supported. But they rebuilt, and the evidence of that rebuilding is visible across the continent in the historical period, in the aquaculture systems, and the stone arrangements, and the landscape management practices, and the social organization that European colonists encountered and failed to recognize for what it was. Let me tell you what the first European explorers of Australia's interior saw, and what they thought they were seeing, and what they were actually seeing. When Edward John Eyre crossed the continent from Adelaide to Albany in 1841, he was travelling through a landscape that had been managed by Aboriginal people for thousands of years. The waterholes he found were not random features of the landscape. They had been maintained. The paths he followed were not simply animal tracks. They were organised routes, some of them maintained by regular use and deliberate clearing over generations. The knowledge he acquired from the Aboriginal people he encountered about where water could be found and how to survive in the arid interior was not casual folk knowledge. It was the distilled product of a tradition of land management that went back further than any European institution that Eyre might have compared it to. What Eyre wrote in his journals, and what other explorers of the period wrote in theirs, reveals the framework through which they saw what they were looking at. They saw a landscape that was wild, unmanned, unmanaged. They saw people who were, in their estimation, living in a state of nature that the rest of humanity had long since left behind. They did not see the aquaculture systems for what they were. They did not recognize the stone arrangements as organized infrastructure. They did not understand the burning patterns as evidence of deliberate landscape management. They could not read what they were looking at because their framework had not been built to read it. This failure of recognition is one of the most consequential misreadings in the history of European expansion. It was not innocent. It was shaped by the ideological needs of the colonial project, which required that the land be understood as empty and the people as without the kind of claims to it that civilization-level organization would have implied. But it was also in part simply a failure of categories, an inability to see what was there, because what was there did not look like what the observers expected civilization to look like. In the century and a half since those early journals were written, our ability to read the Australian landscape has improved enormously. Not because the landscape has changed, but because the tools available to read it have become more sophisticated, and because the framework within which we approach it has become, slowly and with resistance, more adequate to what it is trying to describe. Ground-penetrating radar, satellite imagery, LiDAR, which stands for light detection and ranging, and which can strip away the vegetation cover and reveal the physical features of the landscape beneath it in 3 dimensions. Ancient DNA analysis, stable isotope analysis of sediment cores, optically stimulated luminescence dating, which can determine when sediment grains were last exposed to light and therefore when they were buried, extending our dating capability to periods and materials that earlier methods could not reach. With these tools, the picture of ancient Australia is becoming clearer, and the clarity is consistently in the direction of more complexity, more organization, and more antiquity than the previous framework accommodated. The Budge BIM dating, which places the aquaculture system at 6,600 years ago, was produced by optically stimulated luminescence. The redating of sites across the continent that pushed human arrival back toward 80,000 years and beyond was produced by similar methods. The satellite imagery that has revealed the extent of stone arrangements across the interior, arrangements that were invisible or inaccessible on the ground, has produced site inventories that dwarf what was previously known. And the LiDAR. The LiDAR is perhaps the most dramatic of these tools, because what it has done in other regions of the world, when applied to areas that were previously assumed to be unoccupied or only sparsely occupied, has been astonishing. In Cambodia, LiDAR revealed the full extent of the Angkor civilization, showing that the city was not a small temple complex, but an urban area that, at its peak, was one of the largest cities in the world. In Guatemala, LiDAR over the Maya lowlands revealed a network of cities, roads, reservoirs, and agricultural infrastructure that was far more extensive than anyone had suspected. In Bosnia, LiDAR has been used in the ongoing, contested investigation of the so-called Bosnian pyramids. In the Amazon, it has revealed traces of pre-Columbian civilization across an area that was assumed to be pristine rainforest. LiDAR surveys of Australian landscapes are in their early stages. The technology is expensive to deploy at large scale, and the areas that would be most informative, the submerged continental shelf and the remote interior, are the most difficult to survey. But where LiDAR has been applied to above-ground features in Australia, it has consistently revealed more than was previously visible, more stone arrangements, more earthworks, more modifications to waterways and drainage systems, more of the organized landscape that the pre-existing tools had been unable to fully capture. The full LiDAR survey of the Australian continental shelf, which would require an enormous investment of resources and a scientific community willing to be surprised by what it found, would likely be the most transformative archaeological project of the 21st century. It would tell us, with a clarity that no other method can provide, what was built on the land that the sea swallowed 12,800 years ago and the millennia that followed. It would, I suspect, produce results that would require significant revision of the standard narrative of Australian prehistory. It would, if the physical markers already found at depth are any indication, tell us that what existed on this continent before the catastrophe was not simple. Whether or not that survey is ever conducted, the question it would answer deserves to be asked, and the asking of it is what this story is really about. Because the story of Australia 12,800 years ago is not just a story about a particular place at a particular time. It is a story about what we owe to the past. It is a story about the relationship between the physical record and the knowledge traditions that survived the catastrophe. It is a story about what we choose to see and what we choose not to see when the evidence is in front of us. And it is a story about the fact that the people who lived through the catastrophe and rebuilt from it and maintained their relationship to this land across the 12,800 years that followed are still here, still carry the traditions that survived the fire and the cold and the rising water, and that those traditions are a resource for understanding what happened that no other source can fully replace. I want to sit for a moment with the scale of what we are talking about. 12,800 years. from the Younger Dryas onset to the present day. In that span of time, every civilization that we typically call ancient has risen and fallen. Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, Rome, China, India, the Maya, the Aztec, the Inca, every empire that the history books record, every dynasty that the archaeologists have excavated, every city that the geologists have uncovered from beneath the sediment, falls within this window. From the perspective of 12,800 years, all of recorded history is recent. All of the things we call civilization are the post-catastrophe world. The people of Australia who lived through the Younger Dryas onset and rebuilt their world in the centuries and millennia that followed were contemporaries of the earliest Mesopotamian city builders, of the first Egyptian pharaohs, of the people who built Stonehenge and Göbekli Tepe and the megalithic temples of Malta. They were not behind these civilizations. They were developing in parallel, with different resources, in different ecological conditions, toward different forms of complexity that our frameworks have not been adequate to describe. And before the catastrophe, before 12,800 years ago, they were ahead of almost everyone. The Budgebim aquaculture system was already ancient when the first stones were laid at Stonehenge. The fish traps at Brewarina were already old when the first Egyptian pharaoh united the upper and lower kingdoms. The oral traditions that preserved the memory of the world before the catastrophe were being passed on by communities that had been maintaining them for longer than the Egyptian state has existed. These are not small things. They are among the most significant human achievements in the entire span of our species' existence. And they have been, for most of the period since European contact, either ignored or actively suppressed by a colonial framework that needed to understand the land as empty and the people as without civilization. That framework has been wrong. The evidence for its wrongness has been accumulating for a long time. And the story of what happened 12,800 years ago and what existed before it and what survived it is one of the places where the wrongness is most clearly visible. Let us now look at the question of what happened to the megafauna, because it is directly relevant to the world that existed before the catastrophe and to the catastrophe itself. Australia had, in the period before 12,800 years ago, a megafauna that was, by global standards, extraordinary. Giant wombats, the size of cars. Kangaroos, 3 meters tall. A marsupial lion that was one of the most effective predators in the history of the continent. A giant monitor lizard, Megalania, that was the largest land lizard ever recorded, reaching lengths of up to 7 meters. Diprotodon, a rhinoceros-sized wombat relative that was the largest marsupial that ever lived. A giant cassowary relative, a snake, Wannabe, that was longer than the saltwater crocodile and hunted in a similar manner. These animals were part of the world that the peoples of Australia had been living alongside for tens of thousands of years. The Murujuga petroglyphs include images of the thylacine and of other species that suggest the artists were living at a time when these animals were still present in the regions where the art was made. The oral traditions include accounts of large animals that match the descriptions of Pleistocene megafauna closely enough that some researchers have taken the traditions seriously as evidence of cultural memory of the animals. The diprotodon, in particular, has been proposed as a possible referent for stories of large herbivores in some Aboriginal traditions. The extinction of the megafauna is one of the longest-running debates in Australian archaeology and paleontology. The three main hypotheses are human hunting pressure, climate change, and a catastrophic event. The debate has lasted for decades and has generated a literature large enough to fill a small library. The current consensus, to the extent that there is one, leans toward a combination of factors, with the details varying depending on which specific species are being considered and which time period is being discussed. What is clear is that the megafauna extinctions in Australia were not all simultaneous. Some species went extinct well before 12,800 years ago, in waves that corresponded to earlier periods of climate stress. Others survived to a more recent date, and the most recent extinctions cluster around the Younger Dryas boundary in ways that are consistent with a role for the catastrophic event. The thylacine, the marsupial wolf, survived on the mainland until well into the Holocene, going extinct there perhaps 3,000 years ago, likely as a result of the introduction of the dingo itself, a relatively recent arrival on the continent. It persisted in Tasmania until the 20th century, when European colonizers hunted it to extinction, the last known individual dying in captivity in 1936. The thylacine's mainland extinction is not directly connected to the Younger Dryas, but its presence in Murujuga rock art suggests that the artists were living in a world where the thylacine was still part of the ecological community, which gives the art a minimum age that is itself a piece of evidence for the complexity of the pre-catastrophe world. The broader megafauna extinctions, the diprotodon and the giant wombat, and megalania and the giant kangaroos and the marsupial lion, reduced the ecological complexity of the Australian landscape significantly. These were animals that had been part of the food systems, the cultural systems, and the ecological relationships of the peoples of Australia for a very long time. Their loss was not just an ecological event, it was a cultural event. It changed what could be hunted, how hunting was organized, what the land looked and sounded and felt like. It changed the stories. It changed the ceremonies. It changed the relationship between the people and the land in ways that are encoded in traditions whose full meaning we are only beginning to appreciate. And the loss of the megafauna, combined with the loss of the wet interior, combined with the loss of the coastal territories to rising seas, combined with the population contraction of the Younger Dryas, produced a world that was, by 12,000 years ago, significantly smaller in its ecological and human complexity than the world that had existed before the catastrophe. From that smaller world, the peoples of Australia rebuilt. They are still rebuilding, in the sense that the process of recovering from the colonial catastrophe of the last 2.5 centuries, which imposed a second and in some ways more thorough destruction on what the 12,800-year catastrophe had left, is ongoing. But the rebuilding from the Younger Dryas, the recovery of the post-catastrophe world toward new forms of complexity and organization, is one of the longest and most successful stories of human resilience that we have. The aquaculture system at Budge Bim represents that recovery. Built 6,600 years after the catastrophe, in a location that retained enough water to support the development of new infrastructure, it is a monument to the ability of the people of this continent to look at a changed world and apply to it the knowledge and organizational capacity that their traditions had preserved from the world that came before. The fish traps at Brewerina represent that recovery, the stone arrangements across the interior, the management of water across the Murray-Darling Basin, the burning practices that maintain the ecological diversity of the grasslands and the forests, the oral traditions that encoded the memory of the world before the catastrophe in forms durable enough to survive 12,800 years of transmission. All of this is recovery. All of this is the living evidence of a civilization that was not destroyed, though it was severely damaged, and that continued to develop, in adapted forms, through the long period between the catastrophe and the present. The story of 12,800 years ago is, in the end, not just a story about destruction. It is a story about survival, about what human communities are capable of preserving when the world they have built is taken from them, about the durability of knowledge when it is encoded in the right forms, about the ability of people to carry forward, across generations beyond counting, the essential threads of a culture that was nearly erased by forces beyond their control. And it is a story about what we are still failing to understand about the world that existed before the erasure. The lacunae in the record, the gaps where the evidence should be but is not, the silences that stretch across the period before 12,800 years ago, are not simply the product of time. They are the product of water, which covered the coastal territories. They are the product of sediment, which buried the interior sites. They are the product of colonial frameworks, which did not look for what was there, because they could not conceive of its being there. And they are the product of our own limitations, which are real but not permanent. The tools are improving, the framework is changing, the seafloor surveys are beginning, the LiDAR is being deployed, the genetic analysis is reaching further back with each passing year. The oral traditions are being recorded with the consent and participation of the communities that hold them, with increasing sophistication and care. And the picture that is emerging from all of this, piece by piece, is a picture of a world before the catastrophe that is more complex, more organized, and more worthy of our attention than anything we have been willing to credit. I want to close this part of the story with a specific observation, one that I think captures something essential about the nature of what we have lost and what we have not. In 2003, a team of researchers published a paper describing a set of stone arrangements in the Northern Territory that had been identified through satellite imagery. The arrangements were large, extending over an area of several square kilometers. They were organized in patterns that, when analyzed, showed consistent geometric principles that implied deliberate planning rather than random or casual placement. The dating of the sediment beneath the stones placed their construction at a minimum of several thousand years ago, with some features possibly significantly older. The paper was published in a regional archaeological journal. It received limited attention outside the specialty. The site it described has not been the subject of a comprehensive excavation. It is not on the list of World Heritage Sites. It has not been the subject of a major public exhibition or a widely distributed documentary. It is simply there, in the record, one of hundreds of similar sites that have been identified, but not yet fully studied. This is the state of Australian archaeology, not because the sites are not there, but because the resources, the framework, and the will to study them in the depth they deserve have not yet been fully mobilized. And until they are, the story of what happened 12,800 years ago and what existed before it will remain incomplete in ways that are not inevitable. The story of Australia's oldest cities is not finished. It has barely started. The evidence is in the ground and under the water and in the traditions of the living communities that inherited what survived the catastrophe. Reading it fully will take generations. But the reading has begun. And what it is producing is a history that is, in every sense of the word, extraordinary. Let that sit with you as you rest tonight. Let the image of the Australian interior before the catastrophe settle into the space behind your closed eyes, the full lakes, the green grasslands reaching to every horizon, the communities organized around the water management systems that their ancestors had built and that their descendants were maintaining. The knowledge encoded in the stone arrangements and the oral traditions and the patterns of burning and harvesting that had been refined over 80,000 years of careful attention to the land. Let the catastrophe come, in your imagination, as it came 12,800 years ago. Not all at once, but fast. The fires, the cold, the shrinking lakes, the sea rising over the coastal territories, the population contracting toward the places that retained water, the knowledge that could be preserved being preserved, the knowledge that could not being lost, and then let the long recovery begin. The 6,600 years between the catastrophe and the first stones of the Budgebim eel traps, the continued management of the remaining water systems, the maintenance of the oral traditions, the adaptation of the burning practices to the drier landscape, the rebuilding of social complexity in forms suited to the world that remained. This is the story that the physical record is telling us, and it is, if we are willing to hear it, one of the most remarkable stories in the history of our species. Good night. The stars above Australia tonight are the same stars that the people of Budgebim watched from the edge of their eel traps 6,600 years ago. and the same stars that the people who built the Cunnamulla stone arrangements watched from the flat plain of the interior, and the same stars, only slightly shifted in their positions by the long precession of the Earth's axis, that the people who lived on the now submerged continental shelf watched from the shores of a sea that was 120 meters lower than the sea that is there tonight. They are all part of the same story. And you, resting here, are part of it too. There is a question that archaeologists sometimes ask each other in informal settings, away from the conference panels and the peer-reviewed journals, that rarely makes it into the published literature. The question is, what would we need to find to change our minds? What piece of evidence, what combination of physical markers and dating results and spatial analysis would be sufficient to require a fundamental revision of the standard narrative of Australian prehistory? The question is important because the standard narrative has been remarkably resistant to revision, even as the evidence against it has accumulated. Understanding what would finally break through the resistance tells us something about the nature of the resistance itself. The answer, I think, is that the revision is already happening. It is happening slowly, with friction, and in the careful language of scientific caution, rather than the direct language that the evidence sometimes warrants. But it is happening. The Bujbim inscription was a revision. The redating of human arrival past 80,000 years was a revision. The recognition of Aboriginal oral traditions as genuine historical records, in the sense of accurately preserving information about real events over geological timescales, was a revision. Each of these revisions required the evidence to overcome a threshold of institutional resistance that was higher than it would have been if the evidence had been pointing toward a less inconvenient conclusion. The inconvenience of the conclusion is not arbitrary, it is specific. The conclusion that Australian Aboriginal peoples had developed, over tens of thousands of years, a form of civilization that was sophisticated and organised and geographically extensive, is inconvenient for the colonial history of Australia, which was built on the legal fiction of terra nullius, the claim that the land was empty, that there was no prior claim that the colonists needed to recognise or compensate. Terra nullius was the legal and ideological foundation of the entire colonial project, and it required as its factual underpinning the belief that the people who had been living in Australia before the British arrived had not, in any legally or morally relevant sense, owned the land or built anything on it that would constitute a claim. The High Court of Australia overturned the legal doctrine of terra nullius in the 1992 Mabo decision. But the ideological and psychological residue of the doctrine did not evaporate with the legal ruling. It persisted in the frameworks of academic disciplines, in the assumptions that shaped what questions were asked and what evidence was sought and what conclusions were drawn from the evidence that was found. And it has taken decades of evidence accumulation and the kind of patient, persistent advocacy of researchers both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, who were willing to insist on the implications of what the physical record was showing, to begin to shift those frameworks in the direction that the evidence demands. We are, as I noted earlier, in the middle of that shift. The shift is not complete. The full implications of what is known about Australian prehistory have not yet been absorbed into the standard narrative. The submerged continental shelf remains largely unexamined. The interior sites are understudied. The oral traditions are underutilized as historical sources. The LiDAR surveys have barely begun. But the direction of travel is clear, and the destination is a picture of ancient Australia that is more complex, more organized, and more worthy of recognition than anything that the colonial framework could accommodate. Let me turn now to the question of the Younger Dryas in global context, and to the specific question of what the Australian experience of the catastrophe tells us about the nature of the event. One of the things that makes the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis compelling, despite the scientific controversy it has generated, is the global synchrony of the physical markers. The cosmic spherolites, the platinum anomalies, the nanodiamonds, the burned layers in sediment cores, appear at the Younger Dryas boundary across sites on multiple continents, in locations that are separated by thousands of kilometers and that have no obvious connection to each other than their position in time. This global distribution is difficult to explain by any purely terrestrial mechanism. Volcanic eruptions can produce some of the markers in some contexts, but no single volcanic event or series of events has been identified that would account for the global pattern. The most parsimonious explanation, which is the one that the impact hypothesis offers, is that the global distribution reflects the global footprint of a catastrophic event that affected the entire planet simultaneously. For Australia, the global context matters because it means that what happened at 12,800 years ago was not a local event. The peoples of Australia were not the only civilization that was disrupted. They were one of many. And the fact that the Australian experience of the disruption was, in some ways, more severe than the experience of other regions reflects the specific geography and ecology of the continent at the time, not any difference in the nature of the event itself. The Australian interior was, as I have noted, dependent on monsoon rainfall that was disrupted by the Younger Dryas cold period. The monsoon systems of the Northern Hemisphere were similarly disrupted, but the specific hydrological consequences in Australia were particularly severe because the lake systems of the interior had no alternative water source. In Europe, the rivers that fed the inland lakes of the period had glacial meltwater as a backup. In North America, the Great Lakes system had glacial origins that sustained them through the Younger Dryas. In Australia, the lakes of the interior were fed exclusively by monsoon rainfall, and when the monsoon weakened, they began to dry. The drying was not immediate. It took centuries for lake air and its associated systems to reach their current state. But it was inexorable, and the communities that had organized their lives around the productive lake environments of the interior did not have the option of waiting for the rains to return. They had to move, or they had to die. Most of them moved. The movement of populations from the drying interior toward the coasts and river systems produced exactly the kind of competitive pressure and social reorganization that you would expect from a forced migration. Groups that had occupied separate territories for thousands of years were suddenly in contact with each other, competing for reduced resources, negotiating new relationships in the context of a shared catastrophe. The genetic and linguistic diversity of the resulting populations reflects this period of compression and contact, the mixing of previously separated groups in the corridors and coastal strips that retained habitable conditions through the Younger Dryas. And within that compressed, reorganized world, the knowledge traditions that had been developed in the wetter, more productive interior had to be adapted to the conditions of the drier, more marginal landscape. The burning practices that had maintained the grasslands of the interior had to be modified for the eucalyptus forests of the coastal ranges. The water management techniques developed for the large lake systems had to be applied to smaller, more unpredictable water sources. The social structures that had organized communities across the wide productive interior had to be renegotiated for a world where the territory was smaller and the resources more limited. This adaptation took time. It took generations, and the forms it produced were different from the forms that had existed before the catastrophe, which is why the post-catastrophe record looks different from what we would expect if the pre-catastrophe civilization had simply continued uninterrupted. But the continuity is there, in the underlying knowledge systems, in the organizing principles of the social structures, in the relationship to the land that persisted even as the specific forms of that relationship changed. The Budj-Bim eel traps are one of the clearest examples of this continuity. The specific technology of the basalt channel and weir system is adapted to the specific ecology of the southwestern Victorian landscape, which is not the inland lake environment of the pre-catastrophe interior, but the organizing principle, the deliberate modification of the hydrology of the landscape to create productive aquaculture systems, is continuous with the water management traditions that the physical record suggests were established much earlier. Budj-Bim is not a new idea. It is a new application of an old idea, adapted to a changed landscape by communities whose knowledge traditions had preserved the essential insight through the catastrophe and its aftermath. This is what survival of cultural knowledge looks like. Not the preservation of specific forms, which are tied to specific ecological conditions that may change, but the preservation of the underlying principles that the forms express, which can be applied to new conditions as they arise. The knowledge that moving water can be captured and channeled and used to concentrate fish is the kind of knowledge that, once acquired, can be adapted to any landscape with moving water. The knowledge of which plants manage in which soils, and which burning regimes maintain which ecological communities, is similarly portable in its principles, even when the specific plants and specific soils and specific ecological communities change. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia preserved this kind of fundamental ecological knowledge through the Younger Dryas and the subsequent millennia. They preserved it in oral traditions and in the practices of land management and in the social structures that maintained both. And the result, by the time European colonists arrived, was a living knowledge system of extraordinary depth and sophistication that the colonists were almost entirely unable to recognize for what it was. Let me give you an example of what this knowledge looks like in practice, because I want to ground the abstract discussion in something concrete enough to hold in the mind. The management of fire in Australia is one of the most sophisticated and ecologically significant landscape management practices in the history of our species. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia developed, over tens of thousands of years, a burning regime that maintained the ecological diversity of the continent in ways that modern land managers are only beginning to understand. The burning was not random. It was systematic, seasonal, locally calibrated to the specific ecology of each region, and organized to achieve specific outcomes, including the maintenance of grass cover for grazing animals, the promotion of specific plant species that were used for food and medicine, the management of habitat for animals that were hunted, and the prevention of the kind of catastrophic fuel accumulation that leads to the uncontrollable wildfires that have devastated Australia in the modern period. This knowledge is encoded in oral tradition, in ceremony, and in the institutional memory of communities that have been practicing it for tens of thousands of years. It is knowledge that took generations to develop and that loses specific local calibrations when communities are displaced from the territories they manage. The colonial disruption of Aboriginal land management across Australia through the forced displacement of communities from their territories is one of the factors that has contributed to the increasing severity of Australian wildfires in the modern period. The land that had been managed for tens of thousands of years by careful, deliberate, seasonally calibrated burning was, after colonization, left unburned for long periods and then subjected to uncontrolled wildfire. The ecological consequences have been severe. The recognition of this fact, and the growing effort to incorporate Aboriginal burning knowledge into modern land management, is one of the places where the practical implications of recognizing the sophistication of pre-colonial Australian civilization are most directly visible. It is not an abstract academic question. It is a practical question with consequences for the land and the communities that live on it. And it is a question that is directly relevant to the story of 12,800 years ago, because the burning practices that modern land managers are beginning to incorporate into their approach are, in their underlying principles, continuous with the burning practices that were being applied to the pre-catastrophe landscape. The specific calibrations have changed, because the landscape has changed. But the knowledge that fire is a management tool, that its timing and intensity and spatial pattern determine what the land becomes, is the kind of deep ecological insight that was developed over the long period of organized habitation before the catastrophe, and that survived the catastrophe in the oral traditions and institutional practices of the communities that lived through it. I want now to address a question that I have been circling around without directly confronting, because it is the most difficult question in the whole story, and I want to be honest about the difficulty. The question is, what exactly were the cities? The title of this story promises you cities, ancient cities, wiped out. And I have been talking about aquaculture systems and stone arrangements and water management infrastructure and oral traditions and burning practices, which are all evidence of organized, complex civilization, but which are not, in the conventional sense that the word implies, cities. So let me be direct about this. The physical markers that we have conventionally associated with cities, dense settlement, monumental architecture in the vertical sense, centralized storage and redistribution of goods, written record keeping, the specific cluster of features that we associate with the first cities of Mesopotamia and Egypt, these markers are not present in the pre-catastrophe Australian record, at least not in forms that we have found. And the reasons for this are significant and worth thinking about. The first reason is that the pre-catastrophe Australian landscape did not require the same organizational responses that the Mesopotamian and Egyptian landscapes required. The management of the Nile flood, the organization of large-scale irrigation in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, the concentration of population in defensible settlements in the context of intergroup competition for agricultural land, these were the specific pressures that drove the development of the specific forms of organization that we recognize as cities. Australia, with its vast territory and its distributed water management systems, did not face the same pressures in the same way. The organizational responses that the Australian landscape produced were different, not less sophisticated, but different. The second reason is that most of the physical record of pre-catastrophe Australian organization is either underwater or undiscovered. The coastal territories that were above water before 12,800 years ago, where population density would have been highest and where the most elaborate organizational infrastructure would have been concentrated, are now beneath the sea. The surveys that might reveal what is there have not yet been conducted. We are, in a real sense, making judgments about what was present based on a fraction of the physical record, and making those judgments without having looked in the most likely locations. The third reason is the one I have been talking about throughout this story. The framework that was applied to the interpretation of Australian prehistory was not adequate to recognize the forms of organization that were present. The stone arrangements were categorized as ceremonial rather than infrastructural. The fish traps were categorized as simple rather than engineered. The burning practices were categorized as unsystematic rather than managed. The oral traditions were categorized as mythology rather than history. This systematic misrecognition has produced a record that understates what was there. When I use the word cities in the context of ancient Australia, I am using it in the broad sense of organized, complex, geographically extensive human settlement, not in the narrow sense of the clustered, monumental, literate urban centers of the ancient Near East. The peoples of Australia, before 12,800 years ago, had developed forms of organized habitation that covered vast territories, that involved the systematic modification of the landscape for productive purposes, that required the kind of coordinated, sustained social organization that we associate with the early stages of urban civilization. They called it something else, or perhaps they called it nothing at all, because the question of what to call it had never arisen. It was simply the world as it was. But the thing itself, the organized complexity of habitation and landscape management across the Australian continent, was real. And it was wiped out. Not completely, not irreversibly, because what survived in the oral traditions and the social structures and the continued practice of land management is, as I have argued, continuous with what was lost. But the specific forms of the pre-catastrophe world, the specific expressions of that organized complexity in the specific landscape of the pre-Younger Dryas continent, were destroyed by the catastrophe and by the sea that rose in its wake. The thing that was wiped out 12,800 years ago was a world. And nobody knows, with the precision and certainty that would make the claim uncontroversial, exactly what that world was. That is the honest statement of the situation. And it is, I think, the most important thing I can tell you about this story. Not that the world before the catastrophe was certainly a civilization in the full sense of the word, Not that the impact hypothesis is definitively proven. Not that the oral traditions are a complete and literal record of everything that existed before the catastrophe, but that the world before the catastrophe was more complex, more organized, and more worthy of serious attention than the standard narrative has allowed for, and that we are only beginning to develop the tools and the willingness to understand it on its own terms. The uncertainty is real, but it is not the kind of uncertainty that justifies the dismissal of what is there. It is the kind of uncertainty that justifies the investment of more effort, more resources, more intellectual seriousness in the project of understanding it. The evidence is incomplete. But what is complete, what is fully present in the record, is already extraordinary enough to demand that we take it seriously. Let me now turn to the question of what the Younger Dryas looked like from the inside. Not from the perspective of the sediment core analyst or the stable isotope geochemist, but from the perspective of a person living through it. I want to try to give the catastrophe human dimensions, because it was a human catastrophe, and the abstractions of the physical record tend to strip it of the human texture that makes it real. Imagine that you are a member of a community that has been living around one of the great inland lakes of the Australian interior. Not Lake Eyre as it is today, a dry salt flat that fills with water only in exceptional years, but Lake Eyre as it was 12,800 years ago, a productive body of water, tens of meters deep, supporting populations of fish and waterfowl and the mammals that came to drink at its shores. Your community has been organized around this lake for as long as your oral tradition reaches back. The traditions that describe when the lake was first occupied are not historical traditions in your framework. They are the traditions that describe the beginning of the world, because the lake is, for your community, the center of the world. It is where the food is. It is where the ceremonies are conducted. It is where the dead are buried. It is where the knowledge of the landscape is most dense and most reliable. The changes, when they begin, are not obvious. The first year that the lake level is slightly lower than it was the year before, that is within the range of normal variation. The second year, the same. By the fifth year, the shoreline has receded enough to be noticeable, but there are elders in your community who remember similar recessions in their youth, recessions that reversed after a few years of good rain. By the 10th year, it is clear that this recession is different. The birds that nested at the lake's edge have begun to shift their nesting sites. The fish populations in the shallower areas have declined. The communities that came to the lake each year from the surrounding territories are arriving later in the season, when the fish are more concentrated in the deeper water because the dispersed foraging that the larger lake had supported is no longer as productive. By the 20th year, it is a crisis. The lake is a fraction of its former size. The water management infrastructure that your community has maintained for generations, the channels and weirs and seasonal traps that have organized your relationship to the lake for as long as anyone can remember, is increasingly non-functional, exposed on the receding shore. The territories that neighboring communities occupy, which had been organized around different parts of the lake system, are contracting in the same way. People who had occupied separate territories for generations are competing for the remaining productive areas. The social structures that had managed those relationships when resources were abundant are being tested by conditions they were not designed to handle. And the burning. The fires that had swept through the interior in the decades before the lake began to shrink, burning in patterns and at intensities that no one in your community had experienced in their lifetimes, had changed the vegetation in ways that were still unfolding. Grasslands that had been maintained by careful burning for generations had been replaced, in some areas, by communities of plants that nobody knew how to manage. Animals that had been part of the food system were absent from territories where they had been reliable. The knowledge of the land that your community had developed over generations was, in places, no longer adequate to the land as it now was. This is what the catastrophe felt like from the inside. Not the abstract physics of an impact event, not the numbers in a sediment core, but the slow, grinding, inexorable loss of the world that your community had built its life around, and the desperate, creative, ultimately successful effort to maintain enough of what mattered to rebuild from what remained. The grief of this, the grief of watching the lake shrink, the grief of knowing that the ceremonies that had been conducted at the shore, the places where the dead had been buried, the channels that had been built by your great-grandparents, were going to be lost. This grief is one of the things that the oral traditions preserve, and it is one of the reasons that the traditions about the time before the current world, the time before the catastrophe, carry the emotional weight that they do. They are not simply geographical descriptions. They are elegies. They are the preserved memory of loss on a scale that has no equivalent in the historical period. And they are also something else. They are the preserved record of what survived. Because the grief in the traditions is not the whole of the traditions. There is also the knowledge that was carried forward. The principle of the eel trap, applicable to any waterway that retained enough flow to support it. The burning regime, adaptable to the vegetation communities of the coastal ranges. The social structures, flexible enough to be renegotiated in the context of the new territories. The oral traditions themselves, the mechanism by which all of this knowledge was preserved and transmitted, robust enough to have maintained accurate geographical information for more than 10,000 years. This is what survival looks like. Not the preservation of everything, the preservation of enough. I want to talk now about the sea. The sea level rise that accompanied the end of the last ice age is one of the best documented and most dramatic environmental changes in the period since the Younger Dryas. Over the course of roughly 10,000 years, from about 20,000 years ago to about 10,000 years ago, the global sea level rose by approximately 120 meters. The rise was not uniform. It occurred in pulses, with periods of rapid rise alternating with periods of relative stability. The pulses of rapid rise correspond to the release of large amounts of meltwater from the retreating ice sheets, and some of them occurred fast enough to be perceptible within a human lifetime. For the peoples of Australia, the sea level rise was a catastrophe running in parallel with the Younger Dryas climate disruption. As the ice melted and the sea rose, the coastal territories that had been occupied for plenums of thousands of years went underwater. Not all at once, not dramatically, in the sense of a sudden flood, but steadily, inexorably, with the sea claiming more land each decade, each century, until the continental shelf that had been habitable territory was below the surface. The communities that had occupied that shelf, fishing in the now submerged bays and estuaries, harvesting the shellfish from the now submerged rocky reefs, building their knowledge of the now submerged landscape over generations, had to move. Their movement was the other great forced migration of the post-catastrophe period, complementary to the movement of interior communities away from the drying lakes and toward the coasts and rivers that retained water. And here is the thing that makes the sea level rise particularly significant for the story of 12,800 years ago. The communities moving inland from the flooding coast were arriving in territories that were simultaneously being vacated by communities moving away from the drying interior. The zone between the coast and the interior, the river valleys and the ranges and the coastal plains, became, during this period of dual displacement, one of the most socially complex environments in Australian history. Multiple groups, with different traditions and different knowledge systems and different claims to the landscape, negotiating new relationships in the context of a world that was changing faster than the social structures designed to manage it could easily accommodate. This is the social world that produced the post-catastrophe complexity that is visible in the historical record. The aquaculture systems of the southwestern Victorian coast, including Budgebim, were built in a landscape where Gunditjmara communities had established themselves in the aftermath of the dual displacement. The fish traps of the Murray-Darling system were maintained by communities that had organized themselves along the great river systems in the centuries after the interior lakes dried. The stone arrangements of the interior are found, with increasing frequency as survey methods improve, in the territories of communities that moved into the marginal zones of the interior as the climate slowly restabilized in the early Holocene. The story of Australia 12,800 years ago is, in its full complexity, a story of multiple simultaneous catastrophes. The impact, or the Younger Dryas event, the fires, the climate disruption, the drying of the interior, the rising of the sea, producing a cascade of effects that forced the reorganization of human society across the entire continent within the span of a few generations. The result of that reorganization, the world that emerged from the catastrophe over the following millennia, was different from the world that had preceded it. But it was not empty. It was not simple. It was a world that had inherited the knowledge and organizational capacity of the pre-catastrophe civilization, adapted it to the conditions of the changed landscape, and used it to rebuild, in new forms, the complexity that the catastrophe had interrupted. That is the Australian story. And it is, I think, one of the most important stories in the history of our species. Let me now step back from Australia and look at the global context one more time, because there is a pattern in the Younger Dryas disruption that applies across the world, and that helps us understand what happened to the Australian civilization in relation to what happened everywhere else. Around 12,800 years ago, the Younger Dryas disruption simultaneously affected every region of the world where complex, organized human societies had been developing. In North America, the Clovis culture ended. In the Levant, the Natufian culture retreated. In Australia, the interior civilization was disrupted. In Asia, the early communities of the Yangtze and Yellow River valleys that had been developing the early stages of rice cultivation were set back. In Europe, the hunter-gatherer communities that had produced the cave art of the Magdalenian period, the same tradition that gave us Lascaux and Altamira, were disrupted by the return of cold conditions that had been retreating for thousands of years. The pattern across all of these regions is similar. A catastrophic disruption of a period of development followed by a recovery in modified forms that eventually produced the agricultural civilizations of the early Holocene. The timing of the recovery varies by region. In the Levant, the recovery was relatively rapid, and the Neolithic Revolution emerged there within a few thousand years of the Younger Dryas ending. In Australia, the recovery was longer, because the ecological conditions of the continent required different organizational responses that took more time to develop in the reduced populations of the post-catastrophe period. But the recovery happened, everywhere. The catastrophe did not end human civilization. It interrupted it, disrupted it, forced it into new forms, and in some regions severely damaged the specific traditions and knowledge systems that had been developing before the event. But the human capacity for organization and rebuilding and the maintenance of knowledge across catastrophe was sufficient in every region to produce a civilization on the other side. This is, I think, one of the most important things to understand about the Younger Dryas. It was not the end of human civilization. It was a reorganization of it, and the specific forms that the post-catastrophe civilization took in each region reflect the interaction between the pre-catastrophe knowledge traditions that survived the event and the specific ecological and geographical conditions of the changed landscape. In Australia, the post-catastrophe civilization reflects, above all, the extraordinary durability of the knowledge systems that the peoples of this continent had developed over 80,000 years of careful attention to the land. The oral traditions, the burning practices, the water management principles, the social structures that maintained and transmitted knowledge across generations. These were the elements of the pre-catastrophe civilization that were most durable, most portable, most resilient to the specific forms of catastrophe that the Younger Dryas produced. They survived, and they formed the foundation of the post-catastrophe world. The physical infrastructure, the water management systems of the interior, the coastal settlements, the stone arrangements of the landscape, these were less durable. Some of them were lost to the sea. Some were lost to the drying of the landscape that made them non-functional. Some are buried under sediment that accumulated in the post-catastrophe period. But the knowledge that had built them persisted, and that knowledge, applied to the changed landscape of the Holocene, produced new forms of organized habitation that are visible in the physical record of the post-catastrophe period. Bujbim is the clearest example. The Broarina fish traps are another. The stone arrangements across the interior, which continue to be documented in the satellite imagery, and the ground surveys that are gradually covering the continent, are another. All of these are expressions in the physical record of the post-catastrophe period, of the knowledge traditions that survived the Younger Dryas. They are not continuations of specific pre-catastrophe forms. They are new applications of pre-catastrophe knowledge to post-catastrophe conditions. And underneath all of them, preserved in the oral traditions that are among the most extraordinary human knowledge achievements in the history of our species, is the memory of what came before. The world before the catastrophe. The world that the physical record is only beginning to reveal. I want to close this long journey with a thought about what it means to know a story like this. What it means to sit with the knowledge that a civilization existed before the catastrophe that was in many ways more sophisticated and more organized than the standard narrative of Australian prehistory has allowed. What it means to know that the catastrophe that ended it was probably not a local event, but a global one. A moment when the entire human world was reorganized by forces that no amount of social complexity could fully anticipate or resist. It means, I think, that we should be humble. Humble about the durability of the forms of civilization that we have built in the post-catastrophe world. The 12,800 years since the Younger Dryas onset represent a period of remarkable human achievement. The development of agriculture, of writing, of cities, of science, of the accumulation of knowledge in forms that are more durable than oral tradition alone. But they also represent a period in which we have been building on a planet that is capable, on timescales that are not infinitely long, of disrupting what we have built in ways that we cannot fully predict or control. The peoples of Australia knew this, in the way that knowledge is carried in oral tradition, which is not as abstract proposition but as story, as ceremony, as the lived practice of maintaining relationships to the land that are sustainable across the long timescales of a world that does not stay still. They knew it because they had lived through the disruption and rebuilt from it, and maintained the memory of the disruption in forms that could be passed on to the generations that followed. We have not had that experience in the 12,800 years since the Younger Dryas. The catastrophes we have faced have been large by historical standards, but they have not reached the threshold of the Younger Dryas onset. We do not have the embodied, tradition-carried knowledge of what a global catastrophe of that scale actually requires to survive. We have the physical record, and we have the oral traditions of the peoples who did survive it, and we have the science that is beginning to tell us what happened and why. But the knowledge that is in the body, in the practice, in the long institutional memory of a culture that has actually been through it and come out the other side, that knowledge is carried, primarily, by the Aboriginal peoples of Australia and the other Indigenous communities around the world whose traditions extend back past the Younger Dryas. This is one of the reasons why the destruction of those traditions, through colonization and forced assimilation, and the systematic disruption of the relationships between communities and their territories, is not just a human rights issue, though it is that. It is a loss of knowledge, a loss of the specific form of knowing what it takes to survive on this planet through the long timescales that the planet operates on. And that loss, in a world where the question of long-term survival is not academic, is significant in ways that extend far beyond the communities that suffered the most direct harm. The story of Australia 12,800 years ago is not just a story about the past. It is a story about the present and about the future, and about what we owe to the knowledge traditions that have survived to tell us something about both. Rest now. Let the images settle. The lake, full and shining in the pre-catastrophe sun. The stone arrangements of the interior, organized across a landscape that was greener and more productive than the one that exists today. The oral traditions, preserved across 12,800 years of telling, carrying the memory of the world before the fire and the cold and the rising water. The aquaculture system at Budge Bim, built 6,600 years after the catastrophe by communities that had preserved, through everything, the knowledge of how to work with water and stone, and the life that water sustains. And the seafloor surveys that have not yet been conducted. The LiDAR passes that have not yet been made. The sediment cores that have not yet been analyzed. The oral traditions that have not yet been recorded, with the care and collaboration that they deserve. The picture of ancient Australia that is not yet complete. It will be more complex than anyone expected. It always is. The question of what was wiped out 12,800 years ago does not have a complete answer. Not yet. But the partial answer, the answer that is already available in the physical record and the oral traditions and the comparative analysis of the global evidence for the Younger Dryas event, is already extraordinary enough to require a fundamental revision of the standard narrative of Australian prehistory. That revision is happening, slowly, with friction, in the careful language of scientific caution. But it is happening, and what it is revealing is a world that deserves to be known. A civilization that deserves to be recognized, a catastrophe that deserves to be understood, and a recovery that deserves to be celebrated as one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of our species. Good night. There is something that happens when you spend a long time with a story like this one. Something that is not quite discomfort and not quite wonder, but lives somewhere in between the two. It happens because the story keeps opening, keeps expanding outward in every direction you push it, and it keeps refusing to close into the neat package that the mind tends to prefer. The story of Australia 12,800 years ago is like that. Every time you think you have found the edge of it, you discover that the edge was not a boundary, but a door, and on the other side of the door is more. More evidence, more tradition, more uncertainty, more of the patient, unresolved complexity that is the actual texture of the past. Let me take you to one more place before we move toward the conclusion of this long journey. I want to take you to the Kimberley, which is a region in the far northwest of Western Australia that is, by any measure, one of the most ancient and most remarkable landscapes on Earth. The Kimberley is a plateau of ancient sandstone and basalt, cut by gorges and rivers, fringed by coastlines that were, in the pre-catastrophe period, very different from the coastlines of today. It is a region where the physical and cultural record of human occupation extends back further than almost anywhere else on the continent, and where the art tradition that is preserved on the rocks is among the oldest and most complex in the world. The Wandjina figures are the most striking expression of this tradition. Large, white-painted figures with circular halos around their heads and large, dark eyes, depicted without mouths, standing on the walls of rock shelters across the Kimberley. The Wandjinas are not simply art in the sense of decoration. They are living presences in the traditions of the Ngaranyin, Wurrura, and Wunumbul peoples, beings who created the landscape and continue to be responsible for the rain and the fertility of the country. They must be repainted by the custodians of the tradition when the paint fades, a practice that has been continuous for longer than any document records. The age of the Wandjina tradition is contested, but images that are stylistically related to the Wandjinas have been found at depths of the art sequence that correspond to dates well before the Younger Dryas. The continuity of the tradition, from the pre-catastrophe period to the present, is one of the clearest examples of the durability of Australian cultural traditions across the 12,800-year period. But the Kimberley also holds something else. In the last decade, satellite surveys of the coastal margins of the Kimberley, including the now submerged continental shelf that extended the coast significantly further into the sea before the post-Ice Age sea level rise, have identified a set of features on the sea floor that do not correspond to any known natural geological formation. The features are organized, linear, and occur in configurations that are consistent with constructed rather than naturally formed structures. They have not been formally excavated. The water is deep, and the conditions for underwater archaeology are challenging, but their presence, identified through satellite imagery and echo-sounding surveys, is consistent with what you would expect to find on the submerged coastal territories of a region that was occupied by organized communities before the sea rose to cover it. These features have not been widely publicized. They appear in the technical literature of maritime archaeology and submerged landscape research, where they have attracted interest from specialists, but have not yet been the subject of a comprehensive research program. The reasons for this are partly practical, the cost and complexity of underwater archaeology at depth, and partly the same institutional inertia that has characterized the broader field of Australian prehistoric research. The features are there. They have not been explained. They are one more piece of the incomplete picture that the evidence is working toward. I want to say something about the stars, because in Australia, the stars are part of the story in a way that is not metaphorical. Aboriginal Australians developed, over tens of thousands of years, one of the most sophisticated astronomical knowledge systems in the history of our species. This is not speculation or romantic attribution. It is the conclusion of researchers who have spent years documenting the specific content and precision of Aboriginal astronomical traditions in dialogue with the communities that hold them. The traditions encode knowledge of star movements, lunar cycles, and planetary behavior, with a precision that has been confirmed against modern astronomical data. They encode seasonal information, navigation knowledge, and ecological observation, using the positions of stars and the patterns of the Milky Way as a kind of calendar and map that was available to anyone who could see the night sky. The Milky Way, in many Aboriginal traditions, is not simply a band of stars. It is a river, a landscape, a world that exists alongside the terrestrial world, and that contains the same kinds of knowledge about seasons and resources and relationships that the terrestrial landscape contains. The dark patches in the Milky Way, the spaces between the stars where the galactic dust clouds block the light, are as significant as the stars themselves in some traditions, forming the shapes of animals that mark the seasons and the ecological events of the year. This is a different relationship to the night sky than the one that Western astronomy developed, which focused on the stars as points of light to be measured and catalogued and used for navigation. The Aboriginal relationship to the sky integrated it into the same system of ecological knowledge that organized the relationship to the land, using the sky as an extension of the landscape, a terrain that could be read for the same kinds of information that the terrestrial landscape provided. The precision of this knowledge is remarkable. The ability to use the positions of specific stars to predict the timing of ecological events, such as the migration of birds, or the flowering of specific plants, or the running of specific fish, requires a level of observational accuracy that has been maintained across many generations. The oral traditions that encode this knowledge must have been transmitted with a fidelity that is, by any standard, extraordinary. And this knowledge, like the water management practices and the burning regimes and the social structures, survived the Younger Dryas. It was damaged, certainly, by the catastrophe and by the subsequent disruptions of the colonial period. But the core of it survived, and it is being documented now with the collaboration of the communities that hold it in forms that will allow it to be preserved beyond the lifetimes of the individuals who currently carry it. The documentation of Aboriginal astronomical knowledge is one of the ongoing research programs that is contributing to the expanding picture of pre-colonial Australian complexity. It is not the most dramatic of these programs, in the sense that its findings do not involve the discovery of buried structures or the redating of known sites. But it is, in some ways, the most important, because what it documents is not the physical residue of a past civilization, but the living knowledge of a tradition that has been continuous from before the Younger Dryas to the present. It is not archaeology. It is testimony. And testimony has a different relationship to the past than artifacts do. It is not the shadow of what was there, it is the thing itself, carried forward by people who have been keeping it alive. This is why the story of 12,800 years ago is inseparable from the story of the Aboriginal peoples who lived through it and rebuilt from it and are still here. The past is not somewhere else. It is here, in the knowledge that the communities carry, in the traditions they maintain, in the relationship to the land that has been continuous across the catastrophe and everything that followed. Understanding what was lost at 12,800 years ago requires listening to the people whose traditions have been carrying the memory of that loss for 12,800 years. This listening has not always happened. It is beginning to happen now, in the research programs and the legal recognitions and the slow, partial, still incomplete shift in the frameworks that shape how Australian prehistory is understood. And what it is producing, as I have argued throughout this story, is a picture of the past that is more complex, more organized, and more worthy of recognition than anything the non-listening frameworks could accommodate. Let me take you back to the question I started with. The question about the number that archaeologists do not like to say out loud. 12,800. The number is uncomfortable, not because it is uncertain, though there is genuine scientific uncertainty about some of its specific implications. It is uncomfortable because of what it implies about the world that existed before it, about the level of organization and complexity that was present on this continent and on every other continent in the period before the catastrophe, about the scale of what was lost when the catastrophe came, and about the relationship between the knowledge traditions that survived the catastrophe and the modern world that has, for most of its history, failed to recognize them. The implication that makes the number most uncomfortable is this: the peoples of Australia, before 12,800 years ago, were not behind the rest of the world. They were part of the same global civilization of late Pleistocene human communities that was developing everywhere toward greater complexity and organization. The catastrophe interrupted that development everywhere. In some regions, the recovery produced the specific forms of post-catastrophe civilization that Western history tends to take as the norm. The agricultural civilizations of the Middle East and China and Mesoamerica that produced writing and cities and metallurgy. In Australia, the recovery produced different forms, adapted to a different landscape and expressing a different relationship to the land, but no less sophisticated in their underlying principles, and no less worthy of the term civilization. The distinction between these different forms of recovery is not a distinction between developed and undeveloped. It is a distinction between different kinds of complexity, shaped by different ecological conditions and different organizational traditions. And the failure to recognize this, which has characterized the dominant framework of Australian prehistory for most of the colonial period, is not a neutral failure. It is a failure with consequences. It justified the dispossession of the people who had built and maintained the civilization. It led to the destruction of the knowledge systems that had preserved the memory of the world before the catastrophe. It produced a gap in the historical record that we are only now, with great difficulty and incomplete tools, beginning to fill. The filling of that gap is the project of the current moment in Australian archaeology and anthropology. It is a project that is producing results that are, as I have argued, consistently more complex and more extraordinary than the standard narrative has accommodated. And it is a project that will continue to produce results for as long as there are researchers willing to ask the questions and communities willing to share the knowledge they have been keeping. The story of Australia 12,800 years ago is not finished. It is being written right now in the sediment cores and the satellite surveys and the collaborative research programs between Indigenous knowledge holders and scientific researchers, in the expanding physical record and the expanding recognition of what the oral traditions contain. What we know already is enough to say that something extraordinary was lost, something that deserves to be recognized and mourned and understood. And what is being discovered suggests that the loss was not total, that the knowledge traditions that survived are not simply a fragment of the pre-catastrophe world, but a living extension of it, carrying forward the essential insights of a civilization that was 12,800 years ago, the oldest and in many ways the most sophisticated on Earth. That is the story, and it is one that is worth knowing. I want to end with a specific image, not an abstract one, a specific, physical, locatable image of something that exists in the world right now. In the Willandra Lakes World Heritage Area in New South Wales, not far from where the Mungo Lady was found, there is a stretch of lake shore where the wind has been eroding the sediment for thousands of years, exposing what lies beneath. Bones emerge from the eroding surface in the early morning light, pulled out of the deep time by the patient work of wind and water. Not all of them are human, but some of them are, and each one that emerges is a person who lived in that landscape, who was part of the community that organized itself around the lake, who was buried with care and ceremony by people who loved them. Each one is a specific individual from the world before the catastrophe, or from the long recovery that followed it, or from the millennia in between. The bones do not speak in words, but they are testimony. They are the physical presence of the world that existed before 12,800 years ago, and the world that rebuilt from it, and the world that continued across all the centuries since. They are the evidence that the story is real, that the civilization was real, that the catastrophe was real, and that the recovery was real. They are lying in the pale morning light of western New South Wales, half emerged from the sediment, waiting for someone to look at them with enough seriousness and enough humility to see what they are. This story has been a long one. Thank you for staying with it to the end, or to this point in it, wherever you are in the long drift towards sleep. The story of Australia, 12,800 years ago, does not end here, because the evidence is still being gathered, and the traditions are still being recorded, and the submerged lands are still waiting to be surveyed. But what has been gathered and recorded and discovered is already enough to change how we understand this continent, and the people who have been its custodians for longer than any other human community has been custodian of any other place on Earth. If you are resting now, if the day has finally let you go and the mind is beginning to move in slower, softer currents, let this be the image you carry into sleep. The lake, full. The stone arrangements, organized across the flat interior plain. The burning, deliberate and careful, maintaining the land that has sustained a people for 80,000 years. The oral traditions, moving from mouth to ear across generations beyond counting, preserving the memory of the world before the fire and the cold and the rising water. And the people, not abstract, not primitive, real people as complex and as capable and as human as you are, living in a world that they had built and managed and understood and loved, and watching it change, and finding ways to carry what mattered forward into the world that came after. The stars above Australia tonight are the same stars they watched, a little shifted, a little precessed, but the same. And the knowledge they read from those stars, adapted and transformed by 12,800 years of change and catastrophe and rebuilding and survival, is still being carried by the communities that inherited it. That is enough to know. That, and the fact that the story is not finished. The best of what we will learn about ancient Australia is still ahead of us. In the surveys that have not been conducted, and the traditions that have not been recorded, and the sediment cores that have not been analyzed, and the collaborative research programs that have not yet been funded. When that knowledge comes, it will require us to revise what we think we know, in the same way that every new piece of evidence from this continent has required revision of what came before. The revision will be, as it always is, in the direction of more complexity, more antiquity, more organization, more of the extraordinary human achievement that the standard narrative has been too small to hold. Be ready for it. And for now, rest. The world outside is moving through its own long, slow changes, as it always has, and the stars are where they have always been. And the knowledge that has been carried forward from the world before the catastrophe is still alive, in the communities that hold it, waiting to be heard. Good night. There is a set of questions that any honest account of Australian prehistory has to sit with, even when sitting with them produces more uncertainty than resolution. These are not questions that the evidence has answered, and some of them are questions that the evidence may never fully answer, because the evidence is incomplete in ways that are structural, rather than simply the result of not having looked hard enough. But they are questions that shape everything we think we know about this continent and the people who have called it home for so much longer than we have given them credit for. The first question is the most basic one, and it is the one from which all the others flow. How organized was Australia before 12,800 years ago? Not in the sense of whether there were cities in the conventional definition of that word, because we have addressed that question already, and we have established that the absence of that specific form of organization does not mean the absence of organization, but in the broader sense. What was the scale and complexity of the social structures that managed the continent in the period before the catastrophe? What was the extent of the trade networks? What was the degree of coordination between communities that occupied different territories across the vast continental interior? What was the accumulated depth of the knowledge systems that organized the relationship between the people and the land? The honest answer is that we do not know. The evidence that would allow us to answer this question with precision is mostly not accessible. It is under the sea, or under the sediment, or in the oral traditions in forms that we do not yet have adequate methods to analyze. What we can say is that the evidence we do have is consistently pointing toward answers that are more complex and more organized than the conventional narrative assumed. Every time a new piece of evidence has been examined, every time a new dating method has been applied to a known site, every time a new region has been surveyed with new tools, the results have been in the direction of more complexity, more antiquity, and more organization. This is a pattern, and the pattern suggests that the answer to the basic question, however far it ultimately extends, is in the direction of something larger than we have previously been willing to credit. The second question is about the catastrophe itself. What exactly happened at 12,800 years ago? Was it an impact event, in the specific sense of a cosmic body striking the Earth's surface or exploding in the atmosphere? Was it a cluster of airbursts from a fragmenting comet, distributed across a wide area? Was it a massive solar energetic event that disrupted the upper atmosphere and triggered secondary effects? Was it some combination of these mechanisms? Or was it something else entirely? Some terrestrial process, a massive volcanic eruption, or a sudden release of methane from the ocean floor that produced the same physical markers through entirely different means? The honest answer, again, is that we do not know. The impact hypothesis has accumulated significant evidence in its support, but it has also accumulated significant criticism, and the criticism has not been fully answered. The alternative hypotheses have their own problems. The debate is not settled. What is not debated is that something happened at 12,800 years ago that left a global signature in the physical record. The interpretation of what caused that signature remains genuinely uncertain. This uncertainty is not comfortable, because the story that we are trying to tell, the story of what happened to Australia 12,800 years ago, has a very different character depending on which interpretation is correct. If the Younger Dryas onset was caused primarily by gradual climate processes, then the disruption of Australian civilization was a story of environmental pressure over time, in which communities had at least some capacity to adapt and respond before the worst consequences arrived. If it was caused by a sudden, catastrophic, global-scale event, then the disruption was a story of devastation in a form that no amount of social organization could have anticipated or fully responded to. The difference between these two stories matters for how we understand the scale of what was lost and the nature of what survived. The third question is about the relationship between the physical record and the oral traditions. The oral traditions of Aboriginal Australia contain, as we have discussed, information about real events that has been preserved across timescales that are verifiable through geological and archaeological records. The traditions about sea level rise that Nunn and Reid documented are the clearest example of this, but the traditions contain much more than sea level information. They contain accounts of climatic events, ecological changes, social reorganizations, and relationships between communities that extend back further than any physical record that has been systematically analyzed. How much of this additional content is accurate historical information, preserved across thousands of years with the same fidelity that the sea level information has been preserved? We do not know. The methods for analyzing this question are in their early stages. The collaborative frameworks between researchers and communities that would allow the question to be properly investigated are still being developed. But the question is real, and the possibility that the traditions contain accurate historical information about the pre-catastrophe world and about the catastrophe itself is real and significant. The fourth question is the one that has the most direct bearing on the future. What do we owe to this knowledge? Not in the abstract, but specifically. What is owed to the communities that have been carrying the traditions across 12,800 years, often in conditions of active suppression and deliberate disruption? What is owed to the physical record that is still in the ground and under the sea, still waiting for the investment of resources and attention that would allow it to speak? What is owed to the story itself? The story of a civilization that existed before the catastrophe and rebuilt from it and has been living on this continent in ways that the dominant framework has consistently failed to recognize. The answer to this question is not one that can be given in the language of archaeology or genetics or sediment core analysis. It is a question about obligation, about what kind of history we want to tell, about whose story deserves to be taken seriously, whose knowledge deserves to be respected, whose past deserves to be invested in. I do not think there is a simple answer, but I do think that the story of Australia 12,800 years ago makes certain things clear. It makes clear that the people of this continent had, in the period before the catastrophe and in the long recovery that followed, developed a relationship to the land and a set of knowledge systems that are, by any honest measure, among the most significant human achievements in the history of our species. It makes clear that those achievements have been systematically under-recognized, in part for ideological reasons connected to the colonial project, and that the under-recognition has had real consequences for both the communities whose achievements were not recognized and for the broader project of understanding human history. And it makes clear that the correction of this under-recognition is not simply an academic project. It is a matter of getting the record right, of telling the story that the evidence is telling, of giving the past the recognition it deserves. Let me now turn to a specific element of the story that I have not yet fully addressed, because it requires a somewhat more technical discussion than the rest of the narrative, but that is important enough to the overall picture that leaving it out would be a significant omission. The question of when and how Australia was first populated is directly relevant to the question of what civilization existed there before 12,800 years ago. The earlier and more complex the first arrival, the longer the period of development that preceded the catastrophe, and the more organized the world that was disrupted. The debate about Australian arrival dates has been one of the most contentious in the field for decades. The conventional date, which held with some confidence through the mid-20th century, was approximately 40,000 years. This was based on the best dating methods available at the time, applied to the oldest sites that had been found and analyzed. It was a remarkable enough date by the standards of what was being claimed for human antiquity at the time, making Australia the site of one of the oldest confirmed human populations outside of Africa. But it was also, it turned out, too recent. The revision began in the 1990s and has continued since. Optically stimulated luminescence dating, applied to sites in northern Australia, began producing dates in the range of 60,000 years, then 65,000. The Majid Bebe site in the Northern Territory, published in Nature in 2017, produced dates of 65,000 years for the oldest occupation horizon, with some measurements pushing towards 70,000 years. The Warati site, also in nature, produced evidence of human occupation extending back towards 75 to 80,000 years. These dates are remarkable for what they imply about the initial crossing from Southeast Asia to Australia. At the time of earliest arrival, Australia and New Guinea were joined as a single landmass called Sahul, separated from the Southeast Asian landmass of Sunda by a series of water crossings. The minimum sea crossing required to reach Sahul, even at the lowest sea levels of the period, was approximately 80 to 90 kilometers. Crossing that distance, in open water, in the darkness of the ocean, required boats that were capable of sustained ocean travel, navigation that could orient in the absence of visible landmarks, and the organizational capacity to conduct deliberate, planned voyages. The people who made those crossings were not accidentally transported. They were intentional voyagers, setting out into unknown water with the knowledge and organizational capacity to reach a land that they could not have seen from their point of departure. This is, by any definition, a remarkable human achievement, and the fact that it was accomplished at minimum 65,000 years ago, and possibly as long as 80,000 years ago, means that the people who made those crossings were in possession of a level of technical and organizational capability that is significant in itself, independent of anything that was subsequently developed on the continent. From that initial crossing, 65 to 80,000 years ago, to the Younger Dryas catastrophe 12,800 years ago, is a period of more than 50,000 years. In that period, the descendants of the initial crossers spread across the entire continent, adapting to every ecological zone it contained, from the tropical rainforests of the north to the temperate forests and grasslands of the south and east to the arid desert of the interior. They developed regional traditions, regional languages, regional ecological knowledge, and regional social structures that were adapted to the specific conditions of their territories. They maintained enough connection across these regional traditions to allow the exchange of knowledge and the coordination of activity over the continental scale that the stone arrangements and the trade networks and the management of resources across political boundaries implies. 50,000 years, more than 10 times the span of recorded history. The development that occurred in that period, across a continent of 3 million square kilometers, is something that the physical record has only begun to reveal. And the physical record is, as I've argued repeatedly, incomplete in ways that systematically understate what is there. The pre-catastrophe world, the world of the continent in the final millennia before 12,800 years ago, was the product of that 50,000-year development. It was the culmination of a process of cultural and technological and organizational growth that had been going on for longer than the entire history of agriculture anywhere in the world. And when the catastrophe came, it disrupted that culmination in ways that have taken 12,800 years and counting to recover from. This is the context in which the question, what was wiped out, should be understood. Not a civilization of 2,000 or 3,000 years, just reaching its early stages of organization. A civilization of 50,000 years, developed and mature and organized across the entire breadth of a continent, in the final period of the most hospitable climate the continent had known in its long history. This is what was disrupted. This is what deserves to be recognized. I want to take you now to one more specific place. One more concrete example of the evidence that is building the picture I have been describing throughout this story. In the Pilbara region of Western Australia, there is a creek bed that has become, in recent years, one of the most significant archaeological sites in Australia. It is called the Stony Creek site, and its significance lies not in any single artifact or feature, but in what has been found there in the course of systematic survey over the past decade. The site contains stone tools, hearth remnants, and surface deposits across an area of several hundred square kilometers. The density of the material is extraordinary. The distribution of the material across the landscape is not random. It is organized in ways that reflect systematic use of the landscape over a very long period of time. The oldest material at the site, dated by optically stimulated luminescence from the sediment in which it is buried, is older than anything that the conventional arrival date would predict. Some of the hearth deposits have return dates that place human activity at the site before 60,000 years ago. The stone tool assemblages span the full range of Australian technological traditions, from the oldest to the relatively recent. The site is, in effect, a record of continuous, organised human occupation of a specific location over a period of time that challenges the standard narrative of Australian prehistory at its foundations. The Stony Creek site has been the subject of academic papers, but it has not yet been the subject of the comprehensive, publicly visible research program that its significance warrants. The reasons for this are partly practical, partly institutional, and partly the same pattern of resistance to inconvenient evidence that I have been describing throughout this story. But the evidence is there. The dates are there. The material is there. And what it is saying, in the patient language of physical record, is that the standard narrative is inadequate. This is the state of Australian archaeology in the second decade of the 21st century. A field in which the evidence for extraordinary human achievement across extraordinary timescales is accumulating faster than the institutional frameworks can absorb it, and in which the communities that have been custodians of the knowledge about that achievement are, slowly and partially, and with the complications of history, being brought into partnership with the researchers who are trying to understand it. The partnership is not complete. The complications are real. The history of the relationship between Indigenous Australian communities and the academic institutions that have studied them is not a history that inspires uncomplicated trust. But the partnership is developing, and the results of it, when they come, will be in the direction that this whole story has been moving. More complexity, more antiquity, more organization, more extraordinary human achievement across more extraordinary timescales than the standard narrative has been willing to contain. That is where the story of 12,800 years ago ends, for now. Not with an answer, because the complete answer does not yet exist, but with a direction. The direction the evidence is pointing, the direction the research is moving, the direction the recognition is slowly, with friction and resistance and the patient accumulation of evidence beginning to go, and with an acknowledgement that the peoples of Australia, in their living presence on this continent, in the knowledge traditions they carry, in the relationship to the land they maintain, are not simply the survivors of the catastrophe that ended the world 12,800 years ago. They are the heirs of everything that was built before it. They are the continuation of a civilization whose full extent we are only beginning to understand. And they are among the most remarkable human achievements in the history of our species. 70,000 years of continuous culture on a single continent, surviving the end of the Pleistocene and everything that followed, carrying forward into the present the essential insights of a world that the sea swallowed and the fires burned and the cold diminished but did not, ultimately, destroy. That is worth knowing. That is worth telling. And that is worth, on a quiet night when the day has finally let you go and the mind is moving in its slower currents, sitting with, rest now. The stars above Australia are old enough to have been watched by the people who made those first crossings from Southeast Asia 65,000 years or more ago. Old enough to have been read by the communities that built the Budj Bim eel traps and the Brewarina fish weirs and the stone arrangements of the interior. Old enough to have been in the sky on the night 12,800 years ago when the world changed and the long process of rebuilding began. They are still there. And the knowledge of how to read them is still being carried across 12,800 years of change and catastrophe and survival and rebuilding by the communities that have kept it alive. That continuity is one of the great human achievements. And it is good to know that it exists, that it has endured, that on this long night, while you are resting and the world outside is moving through its own slow changes, the oldest continuous culture on Earth is still here, still knowing things that no one else on Earth has known as long, still carrying the memory of a world before the catastrophe into a world that is still, in its way, recovering from it. Good night. Thank you for coming this far. Whatever part of the world you are resting in tonight, you are connected to this story, because the world that was disrupted 12,800 years ago was not Australia's world alone. It was the world, the human world, in all its distributed complexity, hit by something that changed it in ways that are still rippling through the record 12,800 years later. We are the post-catastrophe civilization. We are the ones who rebuilt, and the oldest and deepest form of that rebuilding is the one that happened here on this continent by these people across this extraordinary span of time. Rest in that knowledge. Let it be, for a while, enough. There is one more thread I want to pull before we let this story settle into the dark. One more strand of the evidence that has not been fully examined. One more region of the picture that deserves to be brought into focus before we close. The thread is this. What did Australia look like from the perspective of the rest of the world in the period before 12,800 years ago? The question matters because the standard narrative of Australian prehistory has, until very recently, treated the continent as essentially isolated, a place where the first arrivals crossed from Southeast Asia and then the connection was severed, leaving the Australian population to develop independently without contact with the rest of the human world until European contact in the 18th century. This isolation narrative has been challenged in recent years by a body of genetic and archaeological evidence that suggests the story was considerably more complex. There is genetic evidence of at least one significant additional migration to Australia after the initial settlement, occurring sometime in the period before the Younger Dryas. This additional migration, which has been detected in the genomes of some Aboriginal Australian populations, appears to have come from South Asia. Its timing and the route it took are not fully established, but its presence in the genetic record is real. There is also the dingo. The dingo is a wild dog that arrived in Australia some 4,000 years ago, well after the Younger Dryas. But its presence on the continent is significant because it arrived with human carriers, which means that the isolation of Australia from the rest of the human world was not as complete as the standard narrative assumed. Someone brought the dingo to Australia 4,000 years ago from Southeast Asia in a deliberate act of transport that required ocean crossing capability. And before the dingo, there is the Macassan trade. The Macassan fishermen of Sulawesi in present-day Indonesia had established regular trade contacts with the Aboriginal peoples of northern Australia long before European contact, visiting the north coast every year to harvest trepang, the sea cucumber that was valuable in the Chinese trade. This contact left linguistic traces, genetic traces, and material traces in the Aboriginal communities of the North Coast, and it demonstrates that the idea of Australian isolation is, at minimum, significantly overstated for the most recent period. How far back does the contact go? The genetic evidence for the South Asian migration suggests that Australia was not entirely isolated even in the period before the Younger Dryas. Trade networks across the Sahul Shelf, between the communities of New Guinea and Australia, which were connected by the land bridge for most of the period of human occupation, almost certainly existed and almost certainly involved the exchange of goods and knowledge as well as genes. And trade across the water crossings between Sahul and Sunda, which the initial migration had demonstrated were not barriers to organized human movement, may have continued in various forms across the entire period of Australian occupation. This matters for the story of 12,800 years ago because it means that the Australian civilization of the pre-catastrophe period was not a closed system. It was in contact, however intermittently and however tenuously, with the rest of the human world. The catastrophe that disrupted it was global, affecting those same networks of contact and exchange. And the recovery from it occurred in the context of a slowly rebuilding global system of human communities, each of which was simultaneously trying to reconstruct the complexity that the Younger Dryas had disrupted. The Australian recovery, which was longer and more difficult than the recovery in regions with different ecological conditions, was nevertheless part of the same global story. And the world that eventually emerged in Australia, the world of the aquaculture systems and the burning management and the stone arrangements and the oral traditions that the historical record describes, was a world that was connected, through whatever threads of contact remained, to the broader human world that was rebuilding around it. This connection does not diminish the achievement of the Aboriginal peoples of Australia. It contextualizes it. It places the most remarkable human cultural achievement in the history of our species in the context of a world that was, itself, recovering from a catastrophe, and doing so through the same mechanisms of maintained knowledge, organizational adaptation, and patient rebuilding that produced the Australian recovery. The global human story, from the Younger Dryas to the present, is a story of recovery, of civilizations disrupted and rebuilt, of knowledge preserved and lost and recovered, of communities forced to reorganize by forces beyond their control and finding, within the constraints of those forces, new forms of the complexity that the catastrophe had interrupted. Australia is part of that story. It is not a footnote to it, not a remote sideshow where a primitive people lived in isolation, while the real human story played out elsewhere. It is one of the central chapters, and in some ways the most extraordinary chapter, of the story of how humanity survived the worst disruption our species has faced in the past 100,000 years and rebuilt from it into the world we live in today. That is the context in which the 12,800 years should be understood, not as the end of something uniquely Australian. As the end of a phase of the global human story, and the beginning of the recovery that eventually produced everything we know as history, we are the inheritors of that recovery, all of us. Wherever we are, whatever our specific ancestry, whatever the specific form of the civilization that the post-Younger Dryas recovery produced in our corner of the world, we are all, in the literal sense, post-catastrophe people. We are all living in the world that was built from the ruins of the world that the Younger Dryas disrupted. And the specific form of that disruption that occurred in Australia, and the specific form of the recovery that followed, is one of the most instructive chapters of the whole story for understanding what the disruption was and what it required to survive. The instruction is this: what survives catastrophe is not architecture, not cities, not writing, not metallurgy, not any of the specific material forms that we associate with civilization, because all of those are tied to ecological conditions and resource availability and social organizations that catastrophe can destroy. What survives is knowledge. The knowledge that is encoded in oral tradition, in practice, in the embodied skills of land management and ecological reading and social organization, the knowledge that can be carried by a person or a community through the most extreme disruption the world can produce and reconstructed in adapted forms on the other side. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia demonstrated this. They carried the essential knowledge of the pre-catastrophe world through the Younger Dryas and the sea level rise and the drying of the interior and the compression of the population into the coastal strips and river valleys that retained habitability. They rebuilt, in forms adapted to the changed landscape, the complexity that the catastrophe had interrupted. And they maintained, across 12,800 years of further disruption, including the colonial catastrophe of the most recent 2.5 centuries, the oral traditions that are the most durable form of knowledge storage that any human culture has produced. This is the lesson. This is the thing that the story of 12,800 years ago is trying to teach, that the most durable human achievement is not any specific form of civilization. It is the knowledge that makes civilization possible, in whatever form the specific conditions of the time and place allow. And that knowledge, when it is preserved in oral tradition and embodied practice and social structure, can survive things that stone buildings cannot. Australia is the proof of this, not in the comfortable, reassuring way that proof is supposed to feel. in the hard, complicated, historically weighted way that a proof that has cost a great deal and is still not fully acknowledged tends to feel. But proof nonetheless. The oldest continuous culture on Earth, carrying forward the essential knowledge of a civilization that was 12,800 years ago among the most developed on the planet, in forms that have survived everything that has been done to suppress and destroy them. That is proof. That is the lesson. And it is worth, on a quiet night, hearing and holding. Let the image of Lake Eyre settle into the darkness behind your eyes. Not as it is today, a salt flat bleached by the sun and the wind, filling only in exceptional years when the rains of the interior cooperate in the right combination, but as it was, full, deep enough that the surface caught the light of the early morning and reflected the ridgeline of the range on the far shore 12,800 years ago, before the rains began to fail. Let the communities that organize their lives around that lake be real. Let them have faces and voices and relationships and knowledge and the same kind of ordinary daily life that you are resting from tonight. Let them have carried their children to the shore in the early morning and watched the pelicans and the ducks and the fish that were sustaining them. Let them have maintained the channels and the weirs that organized their relationship to the water. Let them have passed on the oral traditions that encoded the memory of who they were and where they had come from and what the land required of them. And let the catastrophe come, as it did, changing everything. Let the lake begin to shrink. Let the fires sweep through the interior. Let the cold come down from the north, disrupting the monsoon that the lake depended on. Let the community face the loss of the world it had built and find, in the essential knowledge it had preserved, the means to rebuild. That is the story, and it is still happening. Not with the lake, which is not going to refill on any human timescale, but with the knowledge, with the traditions, with the recognition, slowly extending across the field of Australian archaeology and across the Australian legal and political system and across the global conversation about whose past deserves to be taken seriously, that what was built here and what was lost and what survived is extraordinary. The story does not have a resolution that will arrive in your lifetime, or mine. It is a story that is being written as the surveys are conducted and the traditions are recorded, and the collaborations between Indigenous knowledge holders and scientific researchers produce the new understanding that neither could produce alone. But the direction is clear, and the direction is toward a more complete, more honest, more extraordinary account of what happened on this continent before the catastrophe, and what has been happening here in the long 12,800-year recovery since. You are part of that story now, having heard it, even partially, even in this imperfect and necessarily incomplete form. Having held, for however long you have been resting with this, the image of a world that existed before the catastrophe, and deserve to be remembered. The story is now yours to carry, in whatever way the specific conditions of your own life allow. That is enough. That is more than enough. The oldest living cultural tradition on Earth says that the world is still alive, that the land has memory, that the knowledge encoded in the relationship between the people and the place is not lost when the people are displaced, because the land holds it, and when the people return, the knowledge is there waiting. Whether or not you believe that in the literal sense, it is a useful way to hold the story of Australia 12,800 years ago. The knowledge is there. In the sediment cores and the satellite surveys and the oral traditions and the ongoing research programs and the communities that have been carrying the tradition across the longest span of cultural continuity in the history of our Paki species. It is there, waiting to be fully understood. And the understanding, when it comes, will be one of the great intellectual achievements of the era that is now beginning. Rest now. Tomorrow, the world will continue its own slow work of recovery and rebuilding, as it always has, as it was already doing 12,800 years ago when the lake began to shrink and the communities began to move, and the long process of rebuilding from the catastrophe began. The work continues. The knowledge survives. The story is not finished. But for tonight, it is enough to know that the world before the catastrophe was real and extraordinary and remembered, and that the people who remember it are still here. Good night. There is one last thing that needs to be said about the archaeology of ancient Australia, and it is something that tends to get lost in discussions that focus, as this one has, primarily on the physical evidence and the geological record and the scientific debate. What tends to get lost is the sheer beauty of the thing. Not beauty in the decorative sense, though the art traditions of this continent are, in any fair assessment, among the most beautiful human visual expressions in the world. Beauty in the deeper sense of the word. The beauty of something that was organized and sustained and cared for over a span of time that makes almost everything we typically call civilization look like an experiment that has barely begun. When the Gunditjmara people built the first channels at Bujbim 6,600 years ago, they were not starting from nothing. They were working within a tradition of water management that was already old, that had been developed and refined and adapted over thousands of years before the specific form of the Bujbim system was conceived. The knowledge that produced the eel traps was the distilled product of a process of observation, experimentation, and systematic application that stretched back further than any institution in the world today can trace its own lineage. And what they built, working with basalt stone and the natural hydrology of the landscape and the knowledge their tradition had preserved, was a system that worked, that sustained communities, that maintained its productivity through the changing conditions of the Holocene. That is, to whatever extent the modern management of the area allows it to function, still working today. This is what civilization actually looks like when it is functioning well. Not the monumental, the theatrical, the dramatic, the sustainable, the long-lasting, the adapted to the specific conditions of the specific place. The Bujbim system is a more honest expression of what human intelligence applied to the challenge of living on this planet can achieve than the Colosseum or the pyramids, which were built by coerced labor for the glorification of concentrated power, and which have not, in any meaningful sense, sustained the communities that built them. Bujbim sustained communities for 6,600 years and counting. That is a different kind of achievement, and it is the kind of achievement that the story of ancient Australia is asking us to recognize. The oral traditions have a similar quality of deep sustainability. A knowledge system that can accurately preserve geographical information for more than 10,000 years, the sea level data that Nunn and Reid documented, is not a primitive or inadequate knowledge system. It is a knowledge system that is, in the specific function of long-term knowledge preservation, more effective than any written tradition we know of, because no written tradition has maintained the accuracy and accessibility of its information across 10,000 years in the way that the oral traditions of this continent demonstrably have. The clay tablets of Mesopotamia are 4,500 years old, and they are fragile, require specialist training to read, and are only accessible in museum collections. The Aboriginal oral traditions are more than twice as old and are still being transmitted in living communities by people who use them as practical guidance for understanding the world they live in. This is not an argument against writing. Writing has accomplished things that no oral tradition could accomplish, including the accumulation of technical knowledge at a scale and precision that oral tradition cannot match. But it is an argument for recognizing the genuine achievement represented by a knowledge tradition that has done what no written tradition has yet managed, preserved accurate, usable, geographically specific information across more than 10,000 years of transmission. The peoples of Australia achieved this, and they achieved it under conditions that the rest of the world's knowledge traditions were not subjected to, including the catastrophe of 12,800 years ago and the catastrophe of colonization in the most recent 2.5 centuries. The survival of the oral traditions through both of these catastrophes is not accidental. It is the result of the specific qualities of the knowledge system that was developed on this continent over the long period of organized habitation, qualities that made it more resilient to catastrophe than knowledge systems organized around physical infrastructure and written records. This is one of the reasons why the destruction of Aboriginal oral traditions through colonization was so significant a loss. Not simply because it destroyed the cultural heritage of specific communities, though it did, and that is reason enough to mourn it, but because it destroyed knowledge that is, in the specific form of resilient, long-term, orally transmitted information, unique in the human record. Some of it survived. Some of it is being recovered through the documentation projects that are underway, but some of it is gone, lost with the last speakers of languages that were suppressed before they could be recorded, lost with the elders who died before their knowledge could be transmitted to the next generation in the disrupted conditions of the colonial period. The loss is real. It is part of the story of Australia 12,800 years ago, even though it happened mostly in the last 250 years, because it is a second catastrophe superimposed on the first, a second round of destruction of a knowledge tradition that the Younger Dryas had already damaged and that has been in a process of partial recovery and reconstruction ever since. But the survival is also real. And in the context of the full story, the survival is more remarkable than the loss, because the loss was, by any reasonable expectation, supposed to be complete. The colonial project was, in its most explicit forms, aimed at the complete eradication of Aboriginal culture. The children were taken, the languages were suppressed, the ceremonies were banned. The relationships to the country were severed by forced displacement, and yet the traditions survived, damaged, diminished, in some cases barely hanging on by the thread of a single elder's memory, but surviving. And in the years since, the most oppressive period of the colonial project began to recede, rebuilding, recovering, reasserting themselves in forms adapted to the conditions of the current period, just as they were rebuilt and adapted to the conditions of the post-Younger Dryas period 12,800 years ago. This is the deepest pattern of the story: catastrophe and survival, loss and recovery, the disruption of specific forms, and the reassertion of the underlying knowledge in adapted forms. It has happened at least twice in the history of Australian civilization, and both times the civilization has demonstrated a resilience that is, by any honest measure, extraordinary. That resilience is one of the things that the story of 12,800 years ago is asking us to see. Not in spite of the catastrophe, but because of it. The catastrophe is the test, and the survival is the proof that the knowledge system that was developed on this continent over 80,000 years of organized habitation is one of the most robust and durable in the history of our species. Knowing this changes something. It changes the way the story feels, and the way the evidence looks, and the way the question of what was wiped out 12,800 years ago resonates. Because what was wiped out was not the civilization. The specific forms were disrupted. The specific expressions of the underlying knowledge in the specific landscape of the pre-Younger Dryas continent were lost, some to the sea, and some to the fire, and some to the drying, and some to the catastrophe of more recent history. But the civilization, in the sense of the organized knowledge and social structure and relationship to the land that has been the defining achievement of the Aboriginal peoples of Australia across the full span of their occupation of this continent, that survived. It survived the Younger Dryas, it survived colonization, it is still here. And that is, when you sit with it long enough, the most important thing in the whole story. The question of what exactly caused the Younger Dryas onset will continue to be debated. The question of how complex the pre-catastrophe Australian civilization was will continue to be investigated. The question of what is under the sea on the submerged continental shelf will remain unanswered until the resources are invested to look. These are open questions, and their openness is not a failure of the evidence. It is the honest state of a scientific and historical inquiry that is still in progress. But the question of what survived is not open. It is answered in the living communities that carry the traditions, in the knowledge systems that have been documented with increasing detail over the past several decades, in the ongoing practice of land management and ceremony and oral transmission that has never fully stopped, in the research programs that are gradually building the comprehensive picture that the fragmentary record of the past century has not been able to provide. The civilization of the Aboriginal peoples of Australia, which is the oldest continuous civilization on Earth by any reasonable definition of the term, survived the worst that the world has thrown at it. And it is still here, still knowing things, still carrying the memory of the world before the catastrophe, and the memory of the catastrophe itself, and the knowledge of how to rebuild from catastrophe in ways that are sustainable and deep and organized around the specific conditions of this specific place. That is worth knowing. Tonight, and every night, that somewhere on this planet, there is a people who have been maintaining a relationship to their land for longer than any other human community has maintained a relationship to any place on Earth, and who are still here, still carrying the knowledge, still rebuilding. Good night. If this journey through the deep past of Australia has given you something to rest with, something to carry forward into the dreams that come after this kind of long, slow engagement with the scale of human history, then it has done what it was meant to do. The story of Australia 12,800 years ago is not a comfortable story. It is not the kind of history that resolves neatly, that ends with a conclusion that can be held without complication. It is a story about loss and survival, and the extraordinary depth of human achievement in places and forms that the dominant history has not been adequate to recognize. But it is also a story about the fact that recognition is possible, that the evidence is there, in the sediment and the seafloor and the oral traditions and the living communities, that the framework is changing, slowly and with friction, toward one that is more adequate to what is actually there, and that the story, as incomplete as it is extraordinary enough in its partial form to demand attention and respect and the kind of quiet wonder that is the appropriate response to evidence of human achievement at this scale and across this span of time. Take that wonder into sleep. Let it settle into the background of whatever dreams come, and know that tomorrow, somewhere on the other side of the world, in a landscape that is old beyond easy imagining, people who carry the longest cultural tradition in the history of our species are reading the sky and the land and the water with the same knowledge their ancestors were reading them with before the catastrophe came 12,800 years ago, and changed everything. Good night. Before we finally rest, there is a place I want to show you. A specific, real, locatable place that I have been saving for the end of this story, because it captures something about ancient Australia that cannot be conveyed by data or argument alone. It can only be conveyed by description, by the slow accumulation of detail that lets a place become present in the imagination of someone who has never stood there. The place is called Murujuga. It is on the Burrup Peninsula in Western Australia, on the northwestern coast of the continent, where the ancient rock of the Pilbara meets the Indian Ocean in a landscape of red hills and blue water that is, in any light, at any time of day, among the most striking natural environments on Earth. The hills are composed of granite and gneiss, some of the oldest surface rock on the planet, and they are covered, every surface that the wind and the rain have left rough enough to hold paint, with images. The images at Murujuga number in the millions, not thousands, millions. More than 1 million individual petroglyphs, created by pecking through the dark desert varnish on the surface of the rock to reveal the lighter rock beneath, are distributed across an area of several hundred square kilometers. They cover the rocks of the valleys and the slopes and the ridges. They face in every direction. They are concentrated in some areas and scattered in others. They form assemblages and individual images and sequences that have not yet been fully mapped. The tradition of making them extends from the present day, where contemporary Aboriginal artists continue to add to the assemblage in the practice of a living tradition, back through documented layers of the art sequence to dates that are the subject of ongoing research and genuine scientific disagreement. Some of the earliest images at Murujuga are generally accepted to be at least 20,000 years old. Some researchers argue for dates significantly older. The full extent of the time span represented by the art at Murujuga is not known. Within the assemblage, there are images of animals that are no longer present in the region. The thylacine, which went extinct on the Australian mainland at some point in the past few thousand years, appears multiple times in the Murujuga assemblage. So does what appears to be a long-beaked echidna, a species that was present in Australia during the Pleistocene but is now found only in New Guinea. So do images that some researchers have interpreted as representations of the Tasmanian devil, which is now confined to Tasmania but was once widespread across the mainland. The presence of these images at Murujuga is not simply a record of what animals the artists had seen. It is a record of a world that existed over a span of time so long that the ecological community of the region has changed multiple times within the duration of the tradition. The artists who made the earliest images at Murujuga were living in a world that included megafauna. Some of the images may be records of those animals, made by people who hunted them or lived alongside them before their extinction. The artists who made the most recent images are living in a world where those animals are long gone. The art spans the gap between those worlds. This is one of the things that makes Murujuga unlike almost any other cultural site on Earth. It is not a record of a moment, it is a record of a process. A process of continuous engagement between a people and a place over a span of time that is, by any measure, staggering. The oldest and the newest images exist in the same landscape, made by people who were related to each other across the uncountable generations between them, all participating in the same tradition of attending to the rock and marking what they saw and knew and valued. Murujuga is under threat. The Burrup Peninsula is also the location of a major petrochemical industrial complex, and the emissions from that complex, combined with the direct physical impacts of the development, have been damaging the rock surface in ways that are causing the erosion of some of the oldest and most fragile images. The threat is documented. The advocacy for the protection of the site is ongoing. The inscription of Murujuga on the Australian National Heritage List in 2007 was a recognition of the site's significance, but it has not been sufficient to fully resolve the conflict between the industrial use of the peninsula and the preservation of the art. The story of Murujuga is, in miniature, the story of ancient Australia, a cultural achievement of extraordinary depth and duration, documented and acknowledged but not yet fully protected, still being threatened by the same forces that have threatened Aboriginal culture throughout the colonial period, still being maintained, in the face of those threats, by the communities that have been its custodians across the full span of its creation. The Ngarli people and the broader community of Murujuga Aboriginal groups have been advocating for the full protection of the site and for the recognition of their role as its custodians for decades. The advocacy is ongoing. The recognition is incomplete. And the art continues to be made because the tradition is alive and because the living tradition is itself a form of advocacy, a demonstration that the civilization that created this extraordinary assemblage is not a past civilization but a present one, active and continuous and demanding recognition on its own terms. This is where the story of 12,800 years ago arrives in the present, not in a museum or a university or a government heritage listing. In the ongoing daily practice of people who are still here, still carrying the knowledge, still marking the rock, still maintaining the relationship to the land that has been the defining achievement of this civilization across the entire span of its extraordinary duration. The catastrophe at 12,800 years ago disrupted that practice. The catastrophe of colonization disrupted it further, but the practice continues. And in its continuation, it carries the memory and the knowledge and the relationship to the land that are the living inheritance of everything that was built here before the catastrophe came. That is the final image. Not the full lake, though the full lake is part of it. Not the stone arrangements, though they are part of it. Not the oral traditions, though they are essential. The image that the story ends with is simpler and more present than any of those. It is the image of a hand moving over dark rock in the red light of the Pilbara morning, pecking through the desert varnish to the lighter stone beneath, making a mark that is part of a tradition that began before the catastrophe and has continued through everything since. That hand is the continuity. That mark is the proof that what was built here, across 80,000 years, and through every catastrophe that intervened, is not finished, is not past, is not something that only the archaeology can tell you about. It is here, happening now, on the rock face of a peninsula in northwestern Australia, in the living practice of a civilization that is the oldest on Earth and that shows no sign, despite everything, of stopping. Good night. Rest with that image. The hand, the rock, the red light, the oldest tradition, and know that whatever the morning brings, the tradition will still be there. There is a tradition among some of the Aboriginal peoples of southeastern Australia of ending a ceremony not with a sharp conclusion, but with a slow withdrawal, a fading of the drumming, a gradual quieting of the voices, a letting of the space return to the silence it held before the ceremony began. The ceremony does not end, it recedes. It returns to the country that held it before it was called up, and it waits there for the next time it is needed. This story wants to end that way, not with a conclusion that closes the questions it has opened, not with a summary that reduces the extraordinary to the manageable, but with a slow recession. A return of the story to the country it came from. A silence that holds everything that has been said and lets it settle into the dark at the proper pace. The lake was full. The stone arrangements extended across the plain. The oral traditions moved from mouth to ear across the generations. The fires burned in the careful patterns that maintained the land. The knowledge accumulated, over 80,000 years, in the knowledge holders who carried it. And then the catastrophe came, and the people survived, and the knowledge survived, and the rebuilding began. And on the red rock of the Burrup Peninsula, in the morning light, a hand moved over stone, and the tradition continued. Nah, and it continues still. If this story has carried you through a long night, or helped you find the edges of sleep, then it has done exactly what it was made to do. You can leave a comment below, if the mood takes you, and let me know where in the world you are listening from tonight, and what time it is where you are. I read every one of those comments, and there is something that I find genuinely moving about the geography of them. Someone in Perth, someone in London, someone in a suburb of a city in the American Midwest who has never been to Australia and may never go. All of them, on the same night, resting with the same story about a world that existed before the catastrophe and survived it. If you would like to keep exploring stories like this one, about the places and the times that the standard histories tend to leave out, you can subscribe so that the next one finds you when it is ready. And if you want to support the making of these long, slow, careful journeys into the past, there is a membership option here on the channel, though it is entirely optional and you are welcome here either way. The stars above, wherever you are tonight, are the same ones that have been above Australia for over 80,000 years. Good night.